go. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome today to our convening on immigration and faith here in Oklahoma. I know not everyone on the call is from Oklahoma, but we have some guests with us and others who have been invited, and hopefully today you've been able to make this a priority for your schedule, and depending on which particular panel that you're going to view, and you're welcome to stay on all the way till 5 o'clock. We have a lot of important things scheduled. We have some information. We have a couple of videos that we'll share. But really what we're here to do today is talk about immigration and faith. And so there will be information that hopefully will be helpful to you if you want to become more informed or have more tools to communicate with people in your church or in your ministry or in your family, whoever it might be. But we don't want to inundate you with all the facts and figures today. What we really want to talk about is God's heart for the immigrant and the refugee. And for many of us on this call, how the Lord has continued to open up doors and opportunities for ministry in immigrant and refugee communities, why we believe that's on God's heart, why it's on our heart, why we believe it is an incredible opportunity for mission for the church. And so today we hope that if you are interested, if you're just learning about some of these things, or even if you're very knowledgeable, that you'll be encouraged by some people who are actively involved and engaged in mission and ministry and service among immigrants and refugees, and maybe help you prepare for some ways that you can further get involved, or even maybe anticipate some of the struggles or opportunities that come with some struggles that might be ahead. And so today we look forward to sharing with you and also having some time for question and answer. So I'll give you some more instructions about that as we go. But I want to begin today by thanking all of our hosts and our sponsors. You're going to hear from several people today, some who represent some of these organizations. But my name is Eric Costanzo, and I'm pastor at South Tulsa Baptist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and have been working with the Evangelical Immigration Table, National Immigration Forum, World Relief, and other organizations that work with immigrants and refugees for a little over 4 years now, specifically in this church, though in some previous ministry settings, I've worked with immigrants and refugees in some of these organizations as well. But as I list some of our sponsors, the first one today is Oklahoma Baptist University. OBU is a private Baptist liberal arts school in Shawnee, Oklahoma, founded in 1910. Intricately connected to Oklahoma Baptists, which formerly called themselves the Baptist General Convention of Oklahoma. And OBU is constantly ranked high in every scoring chart that's available, whether it be Wall Street Journal or Forbes. And I am an alum of OBU, so I am a little biased, and I currently serve on the board of trustees. And this is my second tour of duty on the board. So I'm up to date with OBU in the past and the present, and looking forward to a great future there. So very thankful for OBU and being a part as a university sponsor today. You've already heard me mention the Evangelical Immigration Table. We like to describe it as a round table. It's the place where evangelical Christians of various denominations, theological traditions, ethnicities, and political perspectives can gather together. Just as in the Bible, the table represents a place of hospitality and a place where believers come together united by Christ. This is a place for evangelicals and Christians to come together and talk about some of these difficult issues, which everyone knows are very contentious in our culture. We also want to thank the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, the CCCU. They unite higher education organizations. More than 180 Christian institutions are a part of the CCCU. The CCCU has served as the leading national voice of Christian higher education, and their mission is Christ-centered, rooted in our historic Christian faith. The CCU's mission is to advance the cause of Christ-centered higher education and to help member institutions transform lives by faithfully relating scholarship and service to biblical truth. Also, the National Association of Evangelicals, who are represented on this call. The NAE seeks to honor God by connecting and representing evangelical Christians throughout the United States, represents more than 45,000 local churches from 40 different denominations, and serves as a constituency of millions of people. They seek to influence society for justice and righteousness, and to gather the many voices of evangelicals together to be more effective for Jesus Christ and his cause. And then, of course, the National Immigration Forum. The vision of the forum is for the future, a 21st century immigration system that will help new Americans gain opportunity, skills, and the status that they need to realize their full potential. The forum helps Americans advocate for the nation they seek for their children, a nation of laws and a nation of grace. And I've really been blessed to be connected to these organizations. As in my own church, I've had the privilege of seeing the Lord help us develop a very comprehensive ministry to the immigrants and refugees who are right in our community, but also to be connected to immigrants and churches serving immigrants at the border, and to be connected to churches and others serving refugees overseas in places in the Middle East and Africa. I've been so blessed by these organizations to support our church, to give us information, to help me navigate times when there has been conflict or when I have questions I don't know the answer to. And being invited to many of the convenings that happen where Christian leaders come together and they talk about these issues in person. And of course, in the last year, a lot of that's been done on Zoom, but it's been such a blessing to me and has strengthened our ministry and has given me tools and resources that I would not have otherwise had it not been for groups like the Forum, the Evangelical Immigration Table, World Relief, and others. And the CCCU, the NA, they're always very involved in those convenings. And so we're very thankful for all of our sponsors. OBU was going to host an event like this in person, and I know Matt Sorens and some others were going to be coming, and COVID kind of shifted that. So we've postponed it a while. Today it's all virtual, but wherever you are today, we're really glad that you're here. Before I introduce our first panel, I want to just introduce myself a little bit further. And there may be some times as we go where when we're asking questions, for example, you can ask me any questions just as a pastor and how some of this relates to our church. There may be a couple of times as I lead us through today that I say, we had a specific incident, or this is something that we've dealt with directly that I may share briefly in a way that hopefully will be helpful. But really my role today is to moderate and give as much time as we can to hear from our panelists and to ask them questions. So just by way of a further introduction, when I came to our church in South Tulsa almost 5 years ago, I moved from a ministry where I was very much in the urban center of Tulsa. So there we ministered directly to a lot of folks who struggled with poverty, a lot of homeless folks, and had the opportunity to engage immigrants and refugees. If you're familiar with Tulsa, when I moved out to South Tulsa Baptist, South Tulsa, where we are particularly, is a much more affluent area. So I was immediately seeking who is the Lord going to lead us to as a church where we can be welcoming and generous and minister to vulnerable people or connect people in our community who might be disconnected, and use our church as the way to do that. And very quickly realized that most of the refugees in Tulsa have been resettled right around my church. Not only that, but we have a large immigrant and international population in many ways because our local school districts in that part of Tulsa have English language learning programs. They have a lot of tools. They have social workers who work with international families. And so it's great for them to be in those school districts. And whether they were resettled there by the federal government, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or whether they found a way to move there, that neighborhood draws in, our neighborhood draws in the immigrant and refugee population for schools and other resources. And so we immediately began engaging with families from places like Syria and Myanmar and persecuted Christians coming from places like Ukraine. And before we knew it, we had over 30 countries represented in our ministry programs right there on our campus. And so we've liked to describe that as the nations on our doorstep. There they were, and many coming from places that are either unreached or closed in many ways to Western missionaries. And so as our church began engaging in that kind of ministry, it also happened to coincide with immigration and refugee issues really coming to the forefront in the 2016 election. And in the following year, when travel bans were enacted and things along those lines, it wasn't always a safe topic. At least it didn't feel that way. And so we had to navigate some difficult times, but we'll share some links to some different articles about things that have happened in our church. As we go today, there may be some other things that I can share, but I want to just let you know, especially those of you from Oklahoma, that I'm a resource and our church is a resource. If you see some opportunities or want to seek out some opportunities to serve immigrants and refugees in your community, I'd love to share more with you about our story. As things are opening up, I'd love for you to come visit us and see what we're doing in person, or just be a resource and a help to you in any way. Now, this is something I'm very passionate about. Our church has become very passionate about. And so any way we can help in this process, we'll be happy to do that. But the Lord has really blessed our church, and from our children's ministry up, we've seen our church become less all white and much more multi-ethnic. And that has created a lot of new ministry opportunities. And it's also allowed me to develop friendships with some of the folks that are on our first panel. So I'm very honored today to be able to introduce my friends and for you to hear from them. I'll give us a few questions to guide us through, but really what we want to hear from you panelists is your heart today. And our topic is immigration and faith. And so there are a lot of details and information that you all can share, but what we really want to hear is your heart for this, why it's important, and ways that your experience might help our other Christian leaders, ministry leaders, and pastors and others on this call as they engage with these topics, but more importantly, as they serve people. So I want to introduce all of our panelists, and then I'll begin with the first question. First of all, we have Dr. Arleta Harris. She answered a very clear call from God to help immigrants in 2015. She was retired, widowed, and not really looking for another ministry. But she says God was relentless. She began at her church, the Fellowship at Western Oaks Church of the Nazarene, where the district superintendent had challenged them to neighbor their hood and engage the church through welcoming the stranger. Dr. Arleta Harris is the executive director and DOJ accredited representative, Immigration Center at Western Oaks Church of the Nazarene in Oklahoma City. And as all of us will agree, an incredible voice of wisdom and experience and a great heart. Excited that you're going to hear from her today. We also have Dr. John Mark Hart, who's very well known in Oklahoma City for the many ways he serves the marginalized. And his church is excellent at this. He's pastor of Christ Community Church, which is a multi-ethnic congregation in South OKC. He is passionate about equipping God's people to join God's mission of bringing hope and healing to a hurting world. We also have Reverend Nathan Hedge, who is pastor at May Avenue Church. He's also the director of the church's Immigrant Connection Center. Nathan says he knew he was called to lead a multi-ethnic church, but it all took him by surprise in 2014 on a drive home from San Antonio when he was visiting with Max Kolaw, then the Tri-State District Superintendent for the Wesleyan Church. And the discussion turned to an immigrant center at his church. And his prayers were answered, just not how he thought it would be. So Nathan will be able to also share with you some of his experience with being DOJ, Department of Justice accredited. And then Matthew Sorens, who for most of us needs no introduction, but a dear friend and colleague who currently is the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization and Advocacy for World Relief, and also the National Coordinator for the Evangelical Immigration Table. Rather than getting caught up in Matthew's title, is why I said he's currently, really what Matt does is he goes everywhere God leads him, and he advocates for immigrants and refugees. He equips churches, pastors, and many others to do the same work, and is a wonderful, not only expert voice, but someone who has a heart and a call on his life to serve the most vulnerable. So it's an honor to have Matt with us. And Matt, we're really excited. Thank you for coming back to Oklahoma, but virtually this time. Matt is also an author. He's a public speaker. He is very sought after, a lot of publications. He gets asked to write in a lot of different scenarios. And we're thankful for Matt. Follow him on Twitter or other social media if you haven't, and you will always find some very reliable information. So Matt, that was as best introduction as I can give you, but we're ready to hear from our panelists. And so I want to begin, and Arleta, we're just going to begin with you. And the first question, would you just tell us what brought you to be involved with caring for immigrants and refugees? we heard a little bit about this in your bio, but just tell us your heart and how God has brought you into this.
Okay, well, it was God's idea because I grew up in central Illinois where everybody looked like me, and I didn't even know an immigrant. And so when God started talking to me about immigrants, I thought I could pay dues somewhere and maybe support something. So I ran into the evangelical immigration table as I was searching and found out there was no one in Oklahoma. So I called and said, "Who's the person in Oklahoma?" And they said, "We need a church mobilizer. Will you do it?" And I figured I was better than nobody. So I said yes. So that's how I got involved. Um, but for 20 or for 40 years, I have prayed for the 1040 window, that we could somehow reach the people that were in that area around the Mediterranean, that were mostly Muslims. And, we just couldn't get into those countries as missionaries. Now they walk through my door. And I have helped so many people who are Muslims um, with their immigration issues. And then some of them have also come to the Lord. So my prayers have been answered, but I didn't have to leave the country for it to happen. So we've reached people. I haven't even counted up the countries, but we have a map in our office and everybody puts a pin in it. And so, I mean, they're from Hungary and Finland and all over Africa and Asia. And we think of immigrants as coming through the southern border, but they're already here and they're just wanting to get a legal status. So we get to help them do that. It's the most rewarding thing I've ever done. And I'm a volunteer.
Well, volunteers sometimes work the hardest. So thank you, Arlita, for sharing that. And, I think you would agree that in addition to, it's so fun to have folks putting the pin on their map and you learn more about them, but also if you do this long enough, you eat some really amazing food that they bring you from different places. So fringe benefit, but definitely a blessing. In fact, a lot of our immigrants and refugees, food is their love language. So we're very thankful for that. John Mark, same question to you. How has God led you into this, and how's your heart grown in this process?
I think for me, Eric, it's really been a combination of two things. One of them is just a lot of relationships with neighbors who are immigrants who have loved me well over the last 20 plus years. And the other thing is through those relationships, God has kind of used those people to help me have a new set of lenses to read the Bible in a new way. And it actually comes alive to see how much God cares about this issue, which then leads me out into my community in a new way. So as far as my story, I actually grew up in a multi-ethnic, inner city type neighborhood from when I was a little kid. And so I had lots of neighbors from lots of different backgrounds, including immigrant neighbors from when I was very young. But actually really did not understand their situation, how their situation as immigrants was very different than my situation until much later. And that's when I was getting involved in ministry work. And I continued to have just encounters with wonderful neighbors. Often I was the ethnic outsider moving into a majority immigrant, neighborhood or community in the United States, and people welcomed me in and loved me and showed me hospitality. But in the course of ministry, just sharing the gospel and making disciples and teaching the Bible, time after time, just had encounters with people, which I could tell some of these stories later if it would be helpful, but people who, as I'm trying to help them grow in their faith, they're running into massive walls that are kind of hurting them, hurting their children, limiting their capacity to even apply so much of what the Bible says about how to live and flourish as a human being. And as I was asking questions and trying to get involved and trying to help, so often there was things related to their complicated economic, political, legal situation. Because in my case, it's mostly been families that were first generation or second generation immigrants from Mexico. And often they were leaving situations of violence or poverty, trying to find a place where their kids could get educated, but some in the family have legal status and others don't. and it just put them in incredibly difficult situations. And so that then led me to go back and read all that the Bible says about love your sojourner, love the sojourner, and don't oppress the sojourner. And even as we uphold the rule of law, we can be advocates to have more just and compassionate and fitting laws to help people with these kinds of situations. So it's really those relationships leading me to the scripture that then gave me new eyes to see the community.
Thanks, John Mark. And hopefully you all have noticed in your chat box there, we will have a time of question and answer with these panelists here in a few minutes, and you can ask me questions as well. And so if you have a question, if you'll just put that in the chat box, and then we'll do our best to address those here in a few. Nathan, same question to you. Tell us how the Lord has called you into this ministry, and tell us a little bit about your journey.
Well, I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. in Laurel, Maryland, and it's a very diverse area. And so, through the public school system there, had a variety of students that came into contact with from different faith traditions and different ethnicities. And so that always kind of carried over with me as I started pastoral ministry. And there was an event that took place at a church I was on staff with. It was a multi-ethnic church with people from India and Pakistan and the Middle East and Europe and Korea. And so all these ethnic groups would be worshiping together and coming in to have their different services, but we would work together in ministry for the community. And one day the lead pastor called me and said, we need to pray for brother so-and-so from Africa. And I said, what's going on? And he said, well, he's been arrested and might be deported. And I thought, wait, what? This is like my brother in Christ, and his kids are part of our children's ministry, where my wife was the children's director. And like if they lost him and that income, that would be devastating on that family. And so then that was like the beginning for me of starting to look at this issue of immigration from a biblical perspective, and realizing that scripture spoke a little bit differently about immigrants than the position that I was holding at the time. And so it really began a time of wrestling. And then after we came to Oklahoma in 2011, it was in 2014, I attended a basic immigration law crash course in a week. On for immigration. I said, sure, that sounds cool. I can advocate for that. And then he said, well, look like to start a site at May Avenue. And I said, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for that. And but it's that has really allowed me to discover my true passion and heart. And so we opened in December of 2015. We've served around 600 cases from 53 nations, I think we're up to right now, and that's as a part-time office. And we just earlier this year started a partnership with Tyson Food in Enid, Oklahoma, and a lot of their population is from the Marshall Islands, and so they have a very unique immigration status. And so just being able to interact with those cultures, and being able to pray with these different clients from different countries. And it's one of the advantages being a pastor, and offering these legal services, but being able to say, hey, can I pray for you or for your family? And many times that leads to a genuine bonding with the client, and just an opportunity of ministry. So it's just been profound. They have blessed me in both my heart and my stomach As was previously alluded to, I shamelessly tell our clients I work for tacos and they deliver. And I don't have to go for lunch, it comes to me, so it's wonderful. But it's such a blessing to be able to serve the immigrants, and over time develop relationships with them and call them our friends. But it's so rewarding when they see that here's a place where they can be safe, they can be accepted, they can be affirmed, and they can just be themselves.
Well, thank you for sharing, Nathan. And Matt, we're going to come to you next. And, this is what you do for your career. And if anybody's ever heard you speak or teach, they might assume you must have been working with immigrants and refugees your whole life. So is that true?
Yeah, not my whole life. My story is probably a little bit like Arlita's in that I grew up not in Illinois, but where I live now, but in Wisconsin, in a fairly not diverse place. Although even that, I learned later there was Hmong refugees who were settled not that far from where I was living, but I just didn't interact with them. That wasn't something I really thought about. And growing up in a great church that I'm really grateful for, I also don't think I ever heard a sermon that was related to how as Christians we should treat our immigrant neighbors or anything along those lines. So for me, that journey, not too dissimilar from some of the other stories here, it started in college. I was in a class and a friend of mine made an announcement that she was volunteering with World Relief with a refugee family from Rwanda. And this particular family has several daughters and one son. And she said, I've really connected well with this family, especially with the girls, but their 12-year-old boy, I think, would just really benefit from a male mentor. And I thought, I had occasionally been accused of behaving like a 12-year-old, so I could probably handle playing basketball with this young man. And so I signed up, and he became a friend, and his family became friends. And so much so that when I finished college a few months later, I moved into the apartment complex where they lived and where most of my neighbors were refugees or other immigrants from probably 20 different countries of origin, just in that one apartment complex. And around the same time started working with World Relief. And my role at World Relief started doing legal services, so similar to the work that Arlita and Nathan do. And then eventually evolved really working primarily with local churches in the Chicagoland area and then eventually nationally, because we found that so many churches and denominations are really wrestling with the tensions between we want to love and welcome people, we want to share the gospel with people, but this issue is also controversial. And there's people who are not here legally. And even when people are here legally, there's controversy. So, I think a lot of my job is helping to coach churches and denominations through kind of bringing what does the Bible say along with what are the facts, because those are sometimes in short supply in this conversation. And then how does that relate to both ministry opportunities as well as to public policy?
Thanks for sharing that, Matt. And I want to stay with you for just a minute while we have you here. For a lot of folks that maybe they're just sort of learning about this, anybody could have watched whether it was the 100-day speech last night that the president gave, or things that pop up on social media or on news, and immigration and a lot of terms related to immigration pop up a lot. And so I think sometimes just even the clarification of terms is not only helpful to us in ministry and as leaders, but as we communicate, it certainly helps with our churches and folks that we're leading when we can help differentiate between categories. And so would you just give us an update, just sort of briefly in a couple of categories? For those of you who are with us, we are going to talk about issues related to the border and what's happening at the border a little bit later. And we have a video and we'll discuss some things there. But specifically, Matt, would you talk a little bit about refugee resettlement? There's a lot of discussion right now about the president signing the order to allow refugee resettlement to resume and setting a cap for next year. So would you talk to us just a little bit about that? And then if you'll stay with us, I'll give you a couple of other topics as well. Let's start with refugees.
Sure. So just a basic terminology, refugees under both US law and international law are a subcategory of immigrant. So immigrants are people from one country who go live in another. What distinguishes refugees is the reason that they have left their country. So under US law and international law, a refugee is someone who's fled their country of origin because of a well-founded fear of persecution That specifically has to be on account of one's race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. So that's kind of a mouthful, but I think it's basically important to understand that refugees are people who felt they had no choice but to leave, or often because their lives were at risk. Most refugees in the world do not get to come to the United States. There's 26 million refugees in the world, which is actually the highest number since anyone has been tracking these numbers. And last year, only about 12,000 refugees came to the United States. In a more normal time, it might be around 60, 70, 80, 90,000, depending upon the year. But in any case, we're talking about maybe half of 1% of the world's refugees who get invited to the United States. And that's a process that involves sometimes referrals from the United Nations, but then being vetted individually by the United States government. The Department of Homeland Security oversees, and it's a selection process that the State Department leads. In terms of the refugee ceiling, under the US law, the Refugee Act of 1980, the president has the authority and requirement each year to set the ceiling, that is to say the maximum number of refugees who will be resettled to the United States. Again, the historic average, if you go back to 1980, the mean there is about 95,000 for that ceiling. It's been as high as 230,000 going back quite a ways. It's been as low this year as 15,000. President Trump said it at the lowest point ever since the program began last October. President Biden, as most people will be aware, has pledged during the campaign to increase that ceiling rather significantly. The number he said during the campaign was 125,000. In February, his State Department said that because they were coming in the middle of a federal fiscal year, they were going to increase the refugee ceiling to 62,500, sort of prorated that 125,000 for the year, which to us at World Relief seemed like a reasonable ceiling. And then really inexplicably, the State Department said, we're going to do this. They consulted with Congress as required by law, and then they didn't do it. And we didn't know what was happening. The State Department apparently was so confident this was going to happen that they booked flights, and about 700 flights, largely of Congolese refugees, were canceled because there was not the legal authority for them to arrive without this signature from the president. And then 2 weeks ago tomorrow, we got a new refugee ceiling from President Biden, but we were really startled at World Relief and really disappointed that it was actually not a new number. It changed some of the categories, which was helpful, but the number was stuck at 15,000, which that ceiling described as a justified number. And then there was a lot of pushback. We helped to lead some of that pushback, I think, because we were very disappointed. And within a few hours, the White House clarified that actually there would be a new refugee ceiling, increasing the ceiling, not committing to where to increasing it to, but that will happen sometime before May 15th. So that's the status quo. The number still has not gone up. The president is saying it's going to go up, but at the moment, the ceiling is still at a historic low. And that's definitely been a challenge for the organizations like World Relief that are very eager to get back into resettling a historically normal number of refugees. I do think it's important, especially for Christians, to know a lot of these people are persecuted Christians, especially in a state like Oklahoma, where the top country of origin, I'm pretty sure, is Burma. Certainly that's true nationally. About 70% of Burmese refugees are Christians, and it's often their Christian faith. Many of them are Baptists, some Anglicans, some Catholics. That is a primary factor in why they've been persecuted by their government. And when we shut down resettlement, those categories of refugees are shut out alongside those of other faiths or who are persecuted for their religion, their political belief, or those dynamics.
Thanks, Matt. And you're right. Anyone from Oklahoma knows about our Burmese population, especially in Tulsa. And every single one that I've met to this point was persecuted for their Christian faith or something related to their Christian faith is what's drawn them here. And so we appreciate that. And what you referred to as happening with you and Jenny Yang and others leading the way and pushing back on the refugee number that the president announced was an actual, sometimes feels rare case of advocacy and it working, at least appearing to work. And so it reminds us when those things happen that it is worth the effort, even though sometimes the victories seem few and far between. Another area, if you just define it for us, is what we call TPS, temporary protected status. If people hear that, can you just give us a definition of that?
Yeah, so temporary protected status is something under the U.S. immigration laws that the administration, the executive branch, has the authority to extend to individuals from a particular country of origin in response to a situation that has made it, at least temporarily, unsafe or inhumane to return people. So, for example, the Biden administration recently extended this for people from Venezuela as a result of just incredible economic instability in Venezuela, as well as a lot of political persecution. The trick with temporary protected status, it's designated usually, I think, for a couple of years and then can be renewed at the discretion of whoever is president and their government. What's happened in a few specific cases, there's several hundred thousands of people in the United States now who are protected by temporary protected status. So this either means they were on a temporary visa in status when this was designated, maybe they're on a student visa, or they were here unlawfully. They are allowed then to have temporary legal status. They can work lawfully. Most people with temporary protected status are either from El Salvador or a few other countries in Central America, and most of them have been here for 20 plus years. So the problem with temporary protected status is sometimes it's not very temporary, but there's still no possibility for those people, even having been rooted here for 20 years, lawfully living here for 20 years, working, they have to go through a criminal background check for a few years. They have no option to apply for a green card in most cases. So that's one of the things we've seen Congress addressing, at least in the House of Representatives, is to say, let's let people who've been here for that long, who've shown they are contributing, apply for permanent legal status, and that would allow them to eventually apply for citizenship.
Okay, and when we talk about the border later, we will address a little bit more about asylum seekers and the specific situation related to that. But one other that I'd like you to discuss before we bring the other panelists back into the discussion is the group we often call the Dreamers, the DACA recipients. And we have several who are with us today who will be sharing in the second panel this afternoon for students. And we hear a lot about them. And even last night they came up as one of those that at least President Biden suggested that there's very strong bipartisan agreement that a Dreamer solution needs to happen. We've been hearing that for a long time. So would you just give us a brief description of what that's all about and maybe some thoughts on how it could go forward?
Yeah, so the term Dreamer actually comes from a piece of legislation, a bill called the DREAM Act. It's an acronym. I don't remember what it stands for, but it was introduced back in 2001. So that tells you how long this has been an issue. Introduced in 2001 and passed the Senate at one point, passed the House in a different Congress, but it has never passed both of our chambers of Congress and been signed by the president into law. And basically the idea here was, there's lots of immigrants who are undocumented, who are in the country unlawfully. It's been hard for Congress to figure out what to do with that. But there did seem to be a decent amount of bipartisan consensus that we shouldn't hold people who were brought as children responsible for that decision. You're brought as a 5-year-old, you didn't even make that choice. And so, but because of your lack of legal status, people would have difficulty finding work, even going on to college or other opportunities, joining the military. So the idea of the DREAM Act was to let those people earn permanent legal status if they comply with certain requirements. And you also mentioned DACA. So DACA, when the DREAM Act failed several times, after it failed most significantly in 2010, the Obama administration said, we're going to do what we can do at the executive level, which is not give people green cards or paths to citizenship, which only Congress could do. But we are going to defer action on particular cases. We're going to say that we have our high priorities for immigration enforcement, criminals, recent arrivals, terrorists, that sort of thing. But that means we also are going to have our lowest priorities. And our very lowest priority will be someone who was brought here as a child, who's either in school or who has graduated from high school and who has no criminal issues. We're not going to come for them until we find the other 11 million people. And frankly, we don't have the resources for that. So we're going to acknowledge that and give those people the chance to be protected from deportation renewably every couple of years and have work authorization. That program was in place for about 5 years. And then under the previous administration, there was an attempt to undo it, which would have meant several 100,000, I think about 700,000 young people, not all children at this point, in fact, mostly now young adults, some of whom have children of their own because they're in their 30s, who would lose their work authorization, which means losing their jobs and actually be at risk of deportation potentially. So there's been, I think, a good amount of discussion, and we've seen leadership from both sides of the aisle to say, this is actually something that Congress needs to go ahead and resolve so that these young people don't live with that uncertainty, but that they can earn permanent legal status in the United States and eventually become citizens. And again, that's a bill that we recently saw go through the House of Representatives to do that. There's a bipartisan bill in the U.S. Senate right now. Senator Graham from South Carolina and Senator Durbin from my state of Illinois have co-sponsored that. But whether it actually goes through, It's not new to see these bills introduced. What would be new would be to see them actually pass in both chambers.
Thanks, Matt. And our goal, like we said, is not to get too technical, but I think it is important and helpful to not only just describe some of these terms and the current situations that are all very contentious, but also very critical, but also to realize that as our panelists are sharing, we are personally engaged with people in each of these categories. We work with refugees. We work with young people who were brought here by their parents, but have gone to our elementary and middle school, high schools, colleges, who work, and DACA allows them to work and contribute to our communities. We work with folks from Venezuela and places like that who have temporary protected status, asylum seekers who are brought across the border and are allowed to start the processing here if they do end up in Oklahoma. And so this directly relates, and it's helpful to know this information when you dive into how are we going to help folks. And so in the process of helping people, learning these things it may seem technical and hard, but really what you'll be able to do over time is put names and faces with some of these scenarios. And so there's a link that's already in your chat box to the Evangelical Immigration Table resources. There are a lot of resources there that can be like a primer, to start learning a little bit of this. But again, as we mentioned, if you'll follow the forum, the Evangelical Immigration Table, people like Matt on social media, you'll stay up to date, because these things are fluid. Situations and policies change or they're discussed. And so at any point, if you read the resource documents, some minor things can change. So if you want to stay up to date, there are some great organizations and people referenced here that you can follow. But if you go to those resources, you can get sort of a boot camp training level on some of this. And remember that we will here in just a few minutes have a question and answer time for these panelists. So at the bottom of your screen there's a Q&A feature. And if you'll use that, then we can answer questions about specifics or personal questions. So I want to go back to our other panelists for a minute and talk about something that I think will be of interest to everyone. We've already mentioned several times, these issues are contentious. There are strong opinions. There's misinformation. There are a lot of things that are shared that are inflammatory. And it would be easy to get into a fight over the Thanksgiving table or in a church meeting or a Sunday school class if you're not careful. And so knowledge and information is important here, but I think it's also to hear from folks who have been involved in this direct frontline service to immigrants and refugees. And this is sort of a hard question, but I want to ask you all, what does it cost you personally to get involved in whether it's in advocacy or service? Has it cost you, or what have you lost, if anything, in the process here? What's been hard, and has it been worth it? So Arlita, we'll start with you. We'll just go back in order again as we did earlier, if you don't mind sharing a little bit personally there.
I grew up in a home where anything could be discussed. So probably the hardest, most challenging thing for me has been my Sunday night discussions with my brother, who drives a truck on Sunday nights. So we talk about an hour and a half. And he probably has on his Trump shirt and his Trump hat and his Trump socks. And, he's a huge Trump supporter, and actually sounds a lot like QAnon when I talk to him. But we discuss issues, and we discuss a lot about immigration and the border. And it really makes each of us see the other person's viewpoint. And that's what I like about discussing it. I don't think I've lost any friends. There are probably people who would rather not sit with me at lunch, but I can still find a friendly table somewhere. And most people are uninformed. Most people don't know the difference between asylum and refugee and immigrant and, all of these other terms. And so they see what's going on at the border as people who are just hordes of people that are just going to come over the border and somehow take our homes, our jobs, and our lives away from us. And they don't realize what these people are escaping. So it's important that we share what we do. I love sharing stories of people that I've helped that day, and just letting them see the human side of it. One of the things when we first started our immigration center, there was a retired pastor in our church, and he said, Arlita, you could be arrested for what you're doing. And I said, no, I can't. Um, but within 6 months, he was the biggest advocate for what we're doing. And he's really excited about it. And he tells everybody. And every time I put a picture on Facebook of somebody who became a citizen that day, he's the first person to congratulate them. So people come around. It's just our job to inform them and share with them and not beat them over the head about it.
Thank you so much, Arlita. John Mark?
As I'm trying to ponder your question, Eric, I think the difficulty of answering it is my initial response is, what do you mean cost? Because I just feel like I've received so much more from my immigrant neighbors than any sort of cost or price. And it's the same way with anything about following Jesus, right? He tells us to count the cost and follow him. And we need to make decisions of obedience to take up our cross and follow him. But what we get back is so much more than any cost. And so it's certainly been the case that anytime we've gotten involved in trying to do biblical advocacy in relation to controversial issues, we've received some criticism, maybe lost some donors and those kind of things, but so small compared to the joy of obedience. But I think the deeper answer that comes to mind is one of the great sacred privileges of the work that God has called us to do in Christ Community Church is to do Galatians 6:2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And I'll tell you about how that verse, a moment where that verse became very real to me. Probably about 12 to 15 years ago, I got a knock on my door from a young man in his 20s named Jesus, who lived at that time, I was living in a trailer park. I'd moved into this trailer park to do some evangelistic church planting work. And Jesus knocked on my door and said, hey, you don't know me. I've been in a gang and a drug dealer and all these things, but my mom loves Jesus. And the other day, her pastor came over to the house and led me to Christ. And now I want to follow Jesus. And some people told me that you help people learn how to be Christians. Would you mind helping me learn how to be a Christian? And I thought, it is not supposed to be this easy in terms of disciple making. So I said yes, and started getting some time with Jesus. And to be honest, I don't think before or since I've ever had the privilege of investing my life in someone who is more hungry to grow spiritually. Jesus had to go to work really early in the morning, but he always, at least once a week, wanted to take me to breakfast. He'd always buy my breakfast before his work and ask me questions about walking with God. And we'd have our Bibles open, and he'd ask me a question, and I'd draw some diagram of a spiritual principle on a napkin. And then weeks later, I'd go over to his house, and he'd have that napkin like posted on his dresser in his bedroom. He'd been looking at it and meditating on it. I remember when I taught him how to have a daily quiet time and read his Bible, I said, I know you have to get up really early, but maybe you could make a goal of 2 or 3 times this week, taking a few minutes to read the Bible and pray. The next week when he took me to breakfast, he had this notebook filled with like 10 pages of notes he'd been taking on what he was reading every morning. It was just amazing, sharing the gospel with his friends, growing in his faith rapidly. But at the same time, as I was walking with him and he began to disclose his life to me, I just became increasingly aware of how much struggle and pain he was going through. So he was a dreamer, one of these people that Matt was talking about a moment ago, that he was brought to the US as a child by parents who were leaving a situation of poverty and violence, where he couldn't get any education, and they were going looking for an opportunity where they could raise him in a safe place and he could get an education. I think like most dreamers, he didn't even know that he wasn't a US citizen until he'd reached his teenage years. And now he was wrestling with, what do I do? He also had a daughter, and he had a daughter with a woman who was a US citizen. This was before he came to know Christ. But they had broken up. Him and his girlfriend had broken up, and her father was very racist, did not like him, didn't want him to be around his daughter. He felt like he had no legal recourse to go fight a custody battle because he was afraid of getting deported and his family being ripped apart, and then he'd never see her again. For the same reasons, he was tending to work difficult jobs, washing dishes at some local restaurants where he would be called racial slurs and sometimes not really get paid for the work he was doing. You know, there's been a lot of different research that has at different times found, Matt could get better numbers than me, but I've heard numbers in various different cities where they found up to a third of undocumented folks were victims of significant wage exploitation. So he had that going on, and he was just getting increasingly discouraged and depressed. On one hand, he was growing in his faith. On the other hand, he couldn't see his daughter. He had no path towards, though he was hardworking and skilled, no path towards a career that he felt like was going to lead to a future for him. Because of the pressures he was facing at work, he was having to go back to some of his old group of friends that were not a very positive friend group, to mow lawns and do different things to make ends meet. And I will never forget the morning I was over at a friend's house involved with our ministry, and there was a knock on the door, and a police officer held up a picture, said, "Do you know this guy?" And it was a picture of Jesus being walked into a hospital that while he was with that old friend group, he had been shot and killed. And he didn't do anything at all, to deserve this. There's nothing wrong. And I remember grieving. I remember his mom coming over to my house and hugging her and grieving, but I really didn't process fully the grief of that situation until probably a decade later. And what had happened a decade later is there had been an increasing number of these types of stories of people that God sent into my life that I love deeply and they loved me deeply, that were just hurting because of situations they're totally outside of their control. And I just felt God stirring in my heart this call: bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. I didn't know what that meant. Felt like God was calling me to get more involved with those situations. And around that time, the Lord just kind of led me to go on a journey of learning. At that time, the Christian Community Development Association was being led by Noel Castellanos, and they had organized this walk, which was a pilgrimage from Tijuana, Mexico to Los Angeles. And on the walk, we were walking 10 to 15 hours a day. A lot of American pastors and ministry leaders, a lot of immigrants and refugees, and swapping stories. And in the evenings, we were getting educated on all the policy stuff that flows out of Matt when you squeeze him. And so we were being taught all of this stuff, and I was beginning to understand much more deeply what had happened to Jesus and what had happened to all these people and the history behind it. And about the second or third evening of that walk, there was a woman there who was leading a prayer. She had spent years as doing justice work as part of the farm workers struggle. And she led us in the prayer of the farm workers struggle from Cesar Chavez. And the first petition of that prayer says, "Show me the sufferings of the most miserable so that I may know my people's plight." And as she was leading that prayer, I was standing in line. I'm sorry, this story is going really long, but I'm almost to the point here, and then I'm going to mute myself. But as she was reading that prayer, I was standing in line at the nurse's station. There was a nurse volunteer there, helping people with the blisters on their feet because they're 3 or 4 days into this walk. And the person in front of me in the line was named Irene Finnegan, and she was in her 80s, and she had been in a repatriation camp in Prague during World War II. So the Nazis put her and her mom and sister in a repatriation camp. Her sister was killed in that camp. She and her mom escaped and spent weeks traveling hundreds of miles on foot, hiding from people in uniform, stealing food to survive, crawling under fences as part of what was happening with the Nazis in World War II. And her mother had told her the only way we can survive is to forget. And so she had really suppressed all of that. And then this was 2016. And as she was seeing so much in the news about the migration crisis that was global and what was happening, she said, "I saw those people's stories and I remembered what I went through and my mom and sister went through." And she said it was the same thing. There's people that are trying to survive, trying to find a future for their family, hiding from people in uniforms and sneaking under fences just to survive. And she said, I felt so much solidarity. So for the first time, she started telling her story. She was sitting in front of me at the nurse's station. Her feet were covered with blisters. Mine were fine, but this is an 85-year-old woman walking 15 hours a day in hard streets in San Diego. And so her feet were covered in blisters. And as I look at her blisters and I heard, "Show me the suffering of the most miserable that I may know my people's plight," God just began to stir something in my heart that Irene Finnegan were telling the truth. Her feet were telling the truth about what does it mean to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And God just started to stir in me that when I go back home, I need to not just love, in theory, my immigrant neighbors and pray with them and share the gospel and teach the Bible, but I need to enter into the struggle of the pain of oppression that they're experiencing and do whatever I can. And So whatever struggle comes from that, though, is really about sharing in the sufferings of Jesus, and it's more a gift. That was a way long answer. I'm going to mute myself now, but thanks for listening as I have my therapy session with you guys.
Well, just as a reminder, we're going to have Q&A here in just a couple minutes. So if you have, I don't see any questions yet. So if anyone participating has a specific question, I have a couple of others we can ask, but we would sure love to hear from you and know if there's a specific thing that drew you into this discussion today. Nathan, would you just share with us, and has there been any cost to you in your church ministry, personal life in the process of serving immigrants and refugees?
Yeah, I'm going to take a little bit different tactic with this and say yes. But mainly because of my failures as a leader and shortcomings, and of course hindsight is 2020. I wouldn't change what I did, but I would certainly change how I went about it as a result of what I've learned because of what happened as a consequence. But what I wish I had done is a better job at bringing the people in my church along on the journey that I was on. And because of that, when we started to really get active on immigrant ministries, we lost some people. And that was painful. And they had been people who were part of the church for decades before I even came onto the scene, and they felt like they were losing a piece of their identity because the church was changing. And that's a legitimate fear, and it needs to be acknowledged. But the cost for me, it was extremely painful. But again, I wouldn't change it for anything. I wish I don't know if I could have done anything different that would have ultimately changed the result. But today we're a small, multi-ethnic, bilingual congregation that loves immigrants. And before COVID came along, we were having English classes and citizenship classes and legal immigration services, and touching people that never would have come into church otherwise. And I remember one time we had a sister whose husband had been detained because he had a taillight that was out, and he's undocumented, and she's a U.S. citizen, and they have 3 amazing children that would just give you the best hugs on Sunday morning that you could ask for. And she had called me maybe about 1:00 on Sunday afternoon. They were just starting their services and in Spanish, and they told me what happened. I came right up, and we came into this office, and she was fighting back the tears, and she said, "I'm trying to be strong for my sons." And just heart gripping. And we prayed and shared scripture and cried together. That night I was leading a home group, and to that group of gringos, I said, "We need to pray for this family in our church." And I explained what happened, and one of them said, "Why are they always so afraid?" And I said, "Welcome to the world of the immigrant in the United States." And all of a sudden you could hear a pin drop, because they had a face to an issue that they were very well aware of. Well, a few years later, every person in that home group's no longer a part of our church. But I think every church wants to say we're a loving church. But I have seen our people throw their arms around homeless people off the street that come in for food, looking for clothes, looking for a cup of coffee. And I don't know if that would have been the case if those individuals had remained without the Holy Spirit addressing those issues. And so it was intensely painful. And I will tell you, as a pastor, the Lord and I had some conversations. And mainly it was me screaming in the sanctuary and pounding brick walls with my fists. And but at the end of the day, the righteousness of the Lord prevails. And Martin Luther's one of my church history heroes, and at one point he says, "Here I stand, I can do no other." And as I really examined scripture and our neighborhood and what the Spirit was leading, I felt like Martin Luther. Here I stand, I can do no other.
Well, thank you for sharing, Nathan, as well. And I'll just interject for a couple of seconds, and because I see a lot of folks on the attendees list that I know, and our Tulsa folks, and some who know our church, some who don't. But it does cost. There is a cost. You have to count that cost. There is the potential for reactions that if you can absorb them and walk with people, I think I always remember that, I didn't get to this place overnight. It was a journey for me. And a lot of that was done through the personal engagement and meeting people who are vulnerable and in these conditions, and knowing their names and learning their story. But there have been costs at South Tulsa Baptist Church, and immediately, when we first opened up this opportunity and we started using the word refugee in 2017, we lost people quickly. And I know that for Nathan, John, Mark, Arlita, I can sense it. And Matt would say this, I'm sure too. There's a little bit of trauma for us. If we go back and relive all that, it's nothing compared to the trauma that the folks we serve have endured. I would remember that. I'd say I'm dealing with some conflict, but the stories I'm hearing from folks and what they have, they've had to go through and escape. It's nothing. But yeah, there've been hard times, and some people have gone, and some groups have left, with different groups that were using our facility, which opened up rooms for us to serve more and teach more English classes. So it is hard. It's not fun to relive that. It's not fun to go through it. But I do know, and I think, Nathan, you were saying this, if you are faithful and God is calling you to step out into this where there is some risk, he's going to bring people alongside you. And sometimes some may go, but others may come who see this vision, they have this heart, or at least they're open to it, and they'll walk alongside you, and it will be a blessing. And so hang in there if you're dealing with the conflict, or if you're afraid it might come. You'll also learn in the process that you can communicate better, but sometimes to learn to communicate better, you have to fail in your communication. And I certainly have done that. So thank you all for sharing. Matt, let's go to you. And folks, we've got about 10 minutes left for our question and answers. We do have a few questions that have come in. And so, but Matt, would you just share briefly about, some relational costs that have been there for you? And then I'll pick a couple of these questions for our panelists to address. We have a very short time left. So panelists, let's be as succinct as possible.
Yeah, I think my experience is probably similar to what others have already shared. There's some mean people on Twitter, but overall, I've been blessed so richly by my relationships with the immigrants in my own community. I think honestly, if there's a cost, but it's also a blessing in a way. It's, knowing people from so many different parts of the world. I can't watch the news now and just be, apathetic to what's happening right now in Burma or in Ethiopia or in Honduras or in other parts of the world. And I'm reminded that we have, if we're part of a global body of Christ, when one part of the body suffers, every part suffers with it. And it's fairly easy in the context of the United States to not live that out on a global level, to just kind of keep our heads buried in the sand until people whose relatives are at risk. But the other part of that passage in 1 Corinthians 12 is that when one part of the body rejoices, every part rejoices with it. And there's so much joy that comes along with that connection to the global church as well. So I think there's yeah, certainly the benefits outweigh the costs, which turns out is what economists think about immigration on an economic level as well. But I think it's true for church relationships as well.
Thanks, Matt. Well, there are several questions that have come in. We're only going to be able to answer a couple of them, but we'll try to give a personal response to some of you if we can. But I like this first question here. What are some practical first steps for a pastor to use in leading a church to love their neighbors who are immigrants? And we'll be able to provide some answers to some of you directly. But since we have some pastors on the call, could you guys, John Mark, Nathan, could you give us like a 1-minute answer if possible, just some quick practical first steps? And I may add to that as well, but I'd like to give you the panelists the first shot at that.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and it's one I hear frequently. And one of the, I think, most effective ways to start is to reach out in your community and try to start a citizenship class or an English class. If there's someone in your church that feels led in that, those develop relationships and can be very effective as kind of an introduction. And you start to hear some of those immigrant stories, and again, just establish relationships, see the need, learn the need, and you can kind of go from there. So I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, just a couple quick tips. Of course, our greatest resource is the Bible. So I think if you're leading your congregation, always starting with God's word. And so many passages of scripture, Deuteronomy 10, the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, just beginning to teach God's word in a way that is helping your congregation to see God cares about loving everybody, and that includes especially vulnerable people such as immigrants and refugees. There's also, if you've got a smaller group who has a lot of interest, you can take advantage of great books like Welcoming the Stranger to start educating people more on the issues. And then I think the third key thing is relationships. Just start with relationships with immigrants. And the two easiest ways I've found for most of us, it depends on your community, but there's already immigrant churches in your city, probably. So building relationship with pastors or leaders at an immigrant church, so you can just start with those relationships and hear people's stories, could be very powerful. And the other thing is there's probably school systems that have a lot of immigrants, and often those school systems are struggling to have enough resources to help kids that are trying to keep up with their reading levels if English isn't the language spoken in their home. So doing simple things like being tutors and reading buddies in those schools can be a great way, again, to begin connecting your church congregation with relationships with immigrants in your community.
Thanks, guys. And I'll just say that I've written a couple of articles about this with, just some 5 steps for churches to engage their refugee community, immigrant community, and for pastors. And if you can't find those, just reach out to me. Again, I want to be a resource, and especially for you Oklahoma folks, but anyone, be happy to share some things. One of the things that John Mark touched on is connect to your local school. It's very possible that your local school already has some specific targeted ways that they're serving your immigrant and refugee community. And it's never a bad idea for your church to be serving alongside your local schools. It's a great way to reach in the community. So great question. Matt and Arlita, let's let you all fill, and Arlita, we'll start with you, and then Matt, let's let you respond to this next question. Great question. There feels in the American church to be a conflict right now between law and order and loving the stranger, loving the alien, the immigrant. How would you coach and counsel church leaders on leaning into this and living in this tension? It's a great question. Arlita, would you go first?
Okay. I just wanted to add to the last question, and maybe it helps answer this as well. But in our church, we did 13 weeks of a study of Welcoming the Stranger, Matt Soren's book he wrote with Jenny Yang. And we had our group sit in tables of 8, but they couldn't sit with anyone from their Sunday school class or their family. So we had 2 bilingual and 2 Spanish speaking, and, structured the tables So when it was discussion time, they got into real issues and weren't all just saying, well, that isn't a problem. So what really happened is that the Anglos found out that the other people couldn't just go online and put in a credit card and pay $100 and out comes their citizenship form. And the others in the room realized that people really did care about their issues, but they just didn't know about them. So, what it really did in our church, where people used to sit in rather segregated areas, now they don't. They're friends, they go home with each other for lunch. And it really brought our church together. So, I don't know if that answered the question at all, but people just need to get to know each other. And welcoming the stranger was a great way to do it.
Well, to your question on sort of the law and order tension, Eric, I think, that's a biblical concern. On the one hand, of course, and I shouldn't say of course, because maybe this isn't obvious to everyone, but there are dozens of passages that are really clear about loving and caring for immigrants. So there's a really clear mandate there. Obviously, we want to love our neighbors, and they're among that category. We want to make disciples of all nations, and the nations have come to us. So there's all of that. And yet you also have biblical passages like in Romans chapter 13, everyone must be subject to the governing authorities. And that's where that law and order dynamic comes into play. I think it's important to acknowledge most immigrants in the United States have legal status, so it's not even necessarily an issue there. But you have about a quarter of immigrants in the country unlawfully. Either they crossed a border unlawfully or they overstayed a temporary visa. And that's where I think for a lot of Christians is that tension point. But I think if we're going to take Romans 13 seriously, which I think we have to, and it says to be subject to the governing authorities, that doesn't mean throw up your hands and say, don't go near those immigrants. That means we look at what did the governing authorities say? And that means you need to familiarize yourself a little bit with the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is, I'm sorry to subject you to, because it's this book like bigger than your Bible and far less interesting. But the good news about the Immigration and Nationality Act and our immigration laws in general is for a church as an institution or for the average American citizen, there's not much you can do to break immigration laws. This is the question that came up in our elitist context. It's not illegal to serve immigrants. There's no law in the state of Oklahoma or at the federal level that says you can't teach someone English if you suspect they might not be here lawfully, or have them come to your food pantry, or share the gospel with them, or baptize them, or teach them Sunday school, or let them teach Sunday school to you. I'd say with the caveat that if you're going to employ them to do so, then it does become a potential legal issue. Employment is kind of a black and white area. But in terms of church ministry, there's not the conflict that I think some people presume there is. Now, that's harder for our brothers and sisters in Christ who are undocumented. And frankly, many of them, they read their Bibles as well, and they read Romans 13. They usually want desperately to get right with the law. I think that's one of those common misconceptions. People are not here undocumented because of sort of a casual disregard for law. It's almost always because they didn't qualify to come legally in the first place, and they don't qualify to fix their status under current law. And that's why what we've said for a long time at the Evangelical Immigration Table and at World Relief is we don't think amnesty is the solution in the sense of this forgive and forget that there was a violation of law. Nor do we think mass deportation is a good solution to this on a policy level. We don't want to split up. There's literally 4 million US citizen kids with at least one undocumented parent. So we'd be basically a mass process of creating orphans. But we think there's a better way that both honors the law and keeps families together and is compassionate, that would say, if you're here and you have violated immigration law, you can come forward, presuming you haven't committed other serious criminal offenses, violent offenses, that sort of thing. You'd be able to earn permanent legal status if you pay a fine as restitution for having violated the law, then earn permanent legal status, and eventually you'd be qualified to earn citizenship. So we've framed that at the Evangelical Immigration Table as a restitution-based immigration reform. And we found it actually resonates really well with a lot of Christians who are uncomfortable with the idea of amnesty, but also don't want a mass deportation, and also frankly don't want the status quo, which has been going on for much too long and is just not acceptable.
Well, I appreciate you all sharing that. And one of the comments that was made in the question box, I think is important. When we talk about immigrants and refugees, we don't want to misunderstand. And if we call them vulnerable, or if we talk about folks who, need a little bit of advocacy and support, make it sound like they have nothing to offer. I think about it emphatically, empathetically. If I were in a cross-cultural situation, I would need some support. I would need some folks to come alongside me and help me learn a new culture and learn a new language, learn how to navigate things. We will talk a lot in the second half about how Dreamers specifically, they contribute so much to increasing our the benefits to our community and educating and serving. And all of our immigrants and refugees, they have things to contribute. They have things that will bless our churches and our ministries. And you will find that in our church, we have immigrants and refugees reading scripture, sometimes in English and their heart language. We have them in roles where they are serving and leading and contributing. And so it's not always a top down, and we don't mean for it to sound like it's from American born and we are the only ones with something to offer. But there is a period of time for almost every immigrant and refugee where churches can serve them and help connect them. And so that's a great opportunity that I would imagine every community here has. As we go out of this panel, in less than a minute for each of our panelists, would you just share one scripture related to God's heart for immigrants and refugees, one scripture that applies to what we've shared today, that others could connect to? And you may steal from each other, so there's always the benefit of going first. Arlita, will let you go first.
Thank you. Mine isn't so much one scripture, but it struck me that everyone in the Bible was an immigrant. I mean, Jesus was an immigrant, Moses was an immigrant, Abraham was an immigrant, Joseph was an immigrant. There were boundaries in the Bible. Countries had boundaries. They crossed into Egypt, they crossed into Jordan. And so this is not a new thing. And yet the Bible very strongly tells us over and over again how to treat immigrants and where to love them and care for them. And the scriptures that come from, I think of them as coming from Matt's book, but you kind of get them at the same place. And we had our church read those 40 scriptures in English and Spanish before we started it, and that really changed the trajectory of their mind toward immigrants.
Thank you, Arlita. And Welcoming the Stranger, the book that Matt Sorens and Jenny Yang wrote, has been referenced a lot. You can find that in any online bookseller. The chapters on the Bible and history and all are timeless chapters, and the scriptures that are there will be very helpful to all of you. So highly encourage that. And of course, in the chat box, there are other resources that have been listed. John Mark, would you give us a scripture, and then Nathan, and then Matt?
Sure, I'll take us to one I briefly referenced a second ago, Deuteronomy chapter 10. It's a moment where Moses is having kind of a summary statement on the heart of the law. And he's been talking about the importance of responding to God by reflecting his character and letting God renew our hearts from the inside out. And then in that context, he says, for the Lord your God, this is Deuteronomy 10, starting verse 17, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Just a deeply moving passage about God's heart to help people and love people and care for immigrants and refugees, and also one that at the heart of our identity as followers of God is doing the same.
For me, one of the verses that I came across, and I've got a friend that kind of refers to this as the list of God's favorites, and it's Zechariah 7 verses 9 and 10, where God is speaking and he says, "Judge fairly and show mercy and kindness to one another. Do not oppress widows, orphans, foreigners, and the poor." And consistently through scripture, we see those four groups linked together. And whenever you do right by the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, the poor, the marginalized in society, you are consistent with the heart and the will of God. And so that's one of the passages that's really kind of guided me through that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad no one stole mine. So, because there's so many to go to, and I think that's sort of the underlying point is the Bible speaks to this theme so frequently. But I love the passage in Ephesians 2 where the Apostle Paul is specifically speaking to Gentile Christians, and he reminds them that you were separate from Christ, were excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. There's this obviously language of of immigration, of being foreigners and strangers, but then it says, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ." And it goes on to say that the dividing barrier, the dividing wall of hostility between Jews and Gentiles, between different groups of people, has been torn down. So there's this picture, and it goes on, consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household. There's a sense at which in Calvary, Christ's death on the cross is a naturalization day for those of us where we are able to enter into God's kingdom. And that has ramifications not only for our relationship with God through Christ, but also with one another. And it is what makes reconciliation across different groups of people possible. And, I think that ought to inform how we treat people who are considered foreigners and strangers in our land. That for those of us who have been recipients of a cosmic grace, I think we have that ought to be informing how we relate to those who are immigrants in a much more temporal sense and less important sense.
Well, thank you all for sharing. And in those resource documents, you can find, as the Evangelical Immigration Table has shared, 40 scriptures for 40 days, and there you'll never exhaust when you dig into the Bible, the ways that that biblical teaching, commands, and specific stories can relate to God's heart for the immigrant and refugee. And that's why we're here today, to talk about immigration and faith. I want to thank all of our panelists who are also friends and become colleagues. You all are a blessing to me, and you've been a blessing to us. And thank you for your excellent contributions today, but more importantly than that, your heart and your work for immigrants and refugees. And what a wonderful panel this has been. Thank you all again. For those of you who are attending, we're still going. And what we have coming up next, we have a video update from a border trip, followed by a senior policy associate with the National Immigration Forum to talk a little bit about some of these issues. And then we're also going to hear from Women of Welcome, which some of you are familiar with, but an incredible group. And Bree is doing an amazing job there. We're going to hear from them. We're going to hear from the National Association of Evangelicals and Steve Ng, and a lot of great things to share there. And from We Welcome Refugees and Melissa Shepard, who is our Oklahoma rep. So the next little bit, we're going to have some great content for some other folks. And then we're going to pivot at a little bit after 3:30 towards our student panel. And anyone's welcome to join us. We're going to hear specifically from some immigrants, from some dreamers, and hopefully some students will be joining us, and those who work with students. So again, we appreciate all of the support from Oklahoma Baptist University, CCCU, and I'm going to turn it over to our folks from the forum as we look at some videos and talk about some information going forward.
If any of us will put ourselves in those shoes and walk more than 1,000 miles to come to this border, it means that they had strong motivation. If they had fair conditions in their places, they wouldn't migrate. Me personally, I do not understand the roots or the causes of this conflict or this crisis. Whatever the reason is, why they are coming massively, you cannot turn you back. We have to reach out. We have to extend our hands and open our hearts to those people.
Sí, yo salí de mi país el 28 de enero. Tengo dos. Eran tres, pero solo me quedaron dos. Soy amenazado por las pandillas en mi país y me asesinaron un niño.
Unos pandilleros querían que mi hija entregara droga, la querían usar como mula. Entonces mi hija se resistió y no quiso hacer lo que ellos querían que hiciera. Entonces la amenazaron de que le iban a quitar la vida. Como todo padre queriendo proteger a su hijo, fui y le fui a reclamar a los pandilleros y les dije de que no se metieran con mi hija, que nosotros éramos personas cristianas, personas que no queríamos problemas, lo único que queríamos era vivir en paz. Después, como a eso de las 9:30 de la noche, llegaron y hicieron disparos en mi casa. Entonces nosotros lo quisimos salir por la parte de atrás, por la casa de un vecino, ¿verdad? Saqué todos mis ahorros, dejé botado lo que es mis prestaciones, de todo lo que yo he trabajado, y desde ahí decidimos hacer este viaje.
Porque es que no he estado en un solo lugar, he estado un tiempo en uno y me voy para otro porque me andan buscando. Pues.
Corría riesgo con mis hijos.
Cuando nosotros salimos de Honduras venimos sin un peso. No sabíamos a dónde íbamos a llegar, solo lo único que sabíamos que íbamos para Estados Unidos. Durmiendo en el monte, días sin comer nada.
En un monte, ¿verdad? Y vi como unos hombres secuestraron una familia y la llevaron y golpearon al papá de la familia y preguntando por nosotros, pues, ¿dónde está la otra familia? Porque yo me escondí, ¿verdad? Me pude esconderme con mi familia, rogándole a Dios que me ayudara porque yo no sé qué pasó con esa familia. Unos hombres armados se los llevaron
Fui a despedirme en la tumba de mi hijo. Me dio pesar. Un asesino que viola y mata a un niño no te merece la vida. Mi hijo solo tenía 8 años apenas. Cuando venía por el camino, el sufrimiento me hacía recordar. Y yo le decía a Dios, Diosito, tú me tienes mi hijo allá y es el único que me da fuerza para seguir. Decía yo, ya no puedo, ya no puedo. No, yo le pido al gobierno que no trate a los emigrantes así porque no somos seres humanos, no somos gente mala. Si así es como hay gente mala, hay gente buena también.
I left the country when I was 7 years old, so it was the Civil War. A few months after, my mom decided to come, so she sold the house, she sold everything we owned, and we took a tour bus. In El Salvador, the tour bus left us behind and took everything that we owned. That's when I felt I had to grow up very, very quickly. I went through a lot of physical, mental, and sexual abuse because of people that wanted something back for giving you a piece of bread. We had to sleep in bus stops, shelters, and the streets. To be here in America, it was the opportunity of a lifetime that I felt that I got the opportunity to be something and do something with my life instead of being in those countries with no hope and no education, no nothing. You know, now I look back and I can see that God is tying all of that up for the pastoral ministry that my husband and I have. We need to have that compassion and that mercy towards them to be able to understand that they're human beings and not put them as a other.
There he is.
Hi, everyone. My name is Danilo. I'm a Senior Policy and Advocacy Associate with the National Immigration Forum, where I focus on border issues. And so I wanted to just give a brief sort of update on what's happening at the border. And I want to provide some of the most recent statistics and the state of play at the border, even what we've just heard from this past week, just to get beyond some of the headlines and the rhetoric that we've heard. And while I will give some of those numbers that we've seen recently, it's also important, of course, to recognize that behind those statistics are individual stories like the ones that were just shared in that powerful video, and individual people. So, and before also I give this update, I just wanted to touch briefly on sort of who are asylum seekers. So Matt Sorens helpfully discussed refugees in sort of the previous section. And there are many similarities to refugees. Asylum seekers are also those fleeing persecution in their home countries, and that persecution has to be on the basis of sort of particular grounds like religion or political opinion. And US law enshrines the legal right for those fleeing persecution to seek and obtain protection and asylum status at the border and even within the US. So where refugees are resettled from outside of the US, asylum seekers can apply for humanitarian protection right at the border. And of course, not everyone who arrives at the border is eligible for asylum. Seeking asylum and humanitarian protection is really a complicated process that involves numerous legal stages and requires migrants to repeatedly provide evidence and testimony to substantiate their potential eligibility for protected status. So, just diving in a little bit to the context of what we've seen at the border over the last couple of months. So we have seen a significant increase in arriving migrants and asylum seekers, an increase that really started in the middle of last year and has continued through this spring. In March, so last month, we saw 170,000 total arrivals at the border, which is the highest in 15 years. Although we do know that the number was a little bit inflated by repeat crossers, what we call a high, rate of those who are crossing over and over again and being double counted. And that said, just recently, the overall numbers of those arriving have leveled off, according to recent reports, and particularly the number of unaccompanied children arriving are declining. So, beyond those really top line numbers, I think one thing it's really important to recognize right now that, contrary to what some have said, the border is not open. Ports of entry are closed to asylum seekers. All arriving single adults and many families continue to be immediately expelled back into Mexico under a protocol called Title 42 that was started under the Trump administration. And this is even if they express fear of persecution and want to make a claim for asylum. So in some cases, that's actually driving up the overall number of arrivals, as under this expedited Title 42 procedure, single adults can attempt to cross over and over again with no additional punishment. They're just expelled right away. So the majority of all arrivals continue to be returned immediately under Title 42. Now, there are a few groups of those who are being let in by the administration to pursue their asylum claims, and those include families with particular vulnerabilities, such as those with children under the age of 7, and arriving unaccompanied children. So I want to briefly just go into those two groups to talk a little bit more about what's happening to each of them. So starting with families, some families with particular vulnerabilities are being released once they arrive in the US with notices to appear in court or with booking records after the parents are photographed and fingerprinted. And the administration is really working closely with non-governmental organizations and also in particular with groups of faith at the border to help house and care for these vulnerable families as they arrive. And from all accounts, that's going fairly successfully. So turning to the case of unaccompanied children, which I know has really brought a lot of concern to us and to many of the folks who are following this issue. So when children are determined to be unaccompanied when they arrive at the border, they're first brought to CBP processing cells, which are really not meant to house children, particularly for any prolonged period of time. And according to a law that was passed in 2008, which is really designed to prevent unaccompanied children from being returned to contexts of trafficking and persecution, children must be transferred within 3 days, 72 hours, to shelters with under the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, which is under the Department of Health and Human Services. So quickly getting them out of these CBP processing cells and onto ORR shelters, and then eventually onto their parents, as almost 80% of unaccompanied children actually have family members here in the US. And so the idea is to get these children onto their parents as long as they're vetted and given a background check, while they pursue their immigration court proceedings. So what's happened over the past couple of months with the increase in arriving unaccompanied children is that the shelters at ORR have reached capacity, and children were sort of backed up in these overcrowded Customs and Border Protection cells and tent facilities that are really not meant to house children. And that was the real humanitarian crisis that the administration has been facing. Now, just recently, the administration has been really successful at getting some of these children out of those unacceptable conditions in the Customs and Border Protection cells and tent facilities, and into Office of Refugee Resettlement shelters, and also these emergency intake sites that the administration has set up. So, since its peak in mid-March, the number of children held in CBP custody has dropped by 80%. The average amount of time spent in Border Patrol custody, which, as I said, the legal maximum is 72 hours. Over the past couple of months, that number has been up over 100 hours for many children. Now the average number is under 48 hours. So there's been a lot of progress just in the last couple of weeks, last month or so in this area. So, despite these more tempered numbers of overall arrivals and more success at processing unaccompanied children humanely, that doesn't mean that there's not a serious challenge at the border. It doesn't mean that there's not a continued humanitarian crisis at the border that the administration has to continue to address. While the number of arrivals are no longer increasing, they remain quite high, and they are posing a strain on effective border processing. Children have been moved on to these emergency intake sites, but even these sites aren't meant to hold children for prolonged periods of time, and we need to make sure that we can get them onto their families or onto more licensed shelters and foster care as quickly as possible. And the other thing I wanted to quickly note is that this is not a new challenge at the border. We saw it in 2014, we've seen it in 2019, a big influx in 2019 of asylum seekers, just as some of the more restrictive Trump administration policies went into place, including the migrant protection protocols, which forced asylum seekers to wait for their case to be processed in squalid and often dangerous conditions in northern Mexico. So, what we know from some of this past data is that increasing restrictive policies towards asylum seekers at the border or building walls, the data shows this will not really deter asylum seekers from arriving, particularly if we don't address the root causes that are pushing these migrants and children to leave their home countries, as we saw in the video. So addressing those root causes, cracking down on the smuggling networks that profit off the idea of selling an open border, even when the border isn't open, as I discussed before, is really important. And really, to be clear, we don't need to sacrifice border security to treat arriving children and others fleeing persecution with humanity and dignity. And there are some important areas where we can continue to enforce our border. We can modernize our ports of entry, where the vast majority of hard drugs are smuggled. And while we've already spent $10–15 billion on a border barrier, there are certain areas that do need more barriers, more construction, including in Cochise County, Arizona, or Hidalgo County, Texas. So, like I said, we don't need to sacrifice this border security in order to treat arriving asylum seekers and children with dignity and compassion. And by getting past the rhetoric and with the help of faith groups and others at the border and around the country, I think we really can do both, and we can be both a nation of laws and a nation of grace. And that's what the National Immigration Forum believes, and I think what the context on the ground really shows. So I think after this very short update on what is really a complicated situation at the border, I wanted to turn it over to a video introducing the Women of Welcome, which does a lot of really great work around the country.
This is a tricky one for me. It's a great question.
Border or welcoming, it's different things,
I feel like I'm in this journey of understanding the complexities.
You turn on the news and everybody has an opinion. This is our land, and
Safety issues are definitely very real issues.
I'm fine with immigration as long as they do it correctly. It would be naive to say, oh, we're just gonna let anybody and everybody come into America.
If you work hard, you can be successful no matter where you are.
Yes, we can have safe borders and show Christ-like welcome. I think my question is, who are our borders safe for?
This is my awakening. There's color now and then.
I would want to say to another mother who is seeking asylum that I'm so sorry. And also that you are doing a great job. And that all the little things you do for your kid, that all those little things matter. And that it is beautiful and holy work.
In the kingdom that Jesus talks about, there is no us and them, there's only broken people.
Leviticus 19:33.
When a foreigner lives among you, treat them as if they were native born.
I was a stranger, and you invited me in.
There's the verse in 1 John 3.
I think as a church, I think our call is to get closer.
It's very easy to judge, but as soon as you leave this situation is when you're gonna feel it.
You know, in the Bible, it talks about how this metaphor of being welcomed with a robe and a kiss and a party.
And for me at my age, that sometimes I forget that there's something that I can do to make a difference in this world.
How could I after what I've seen?
Hi, my name is Steve Eng, and I'm the Advocacy Director for the National Association of Evangelicals. I would like to invite you to a upcoming webinar that we are doing that is focused on Oklahoma. It's called Advocating for Vulnerable Families in Oklahoma. It'll be happening on Tuesday, May 18th from 1 to 2 o'clock p.m. And just one moment here. I changed my focus. Sorry about that. And many of you are involved in Oklahoma in various advocacy efforts and help with vulnerable people in your communities. And we have a number of people who will be presenting on this panel as we take a look at how you can advocate for vulnerable families in your community. And that also includes low-income families and workers as we take a look at some of the tax credits where there's lively debate in Washington. Our presenters for our panelists will include Dr. Adrian Hinkle from Southwestern Christian University, who will be laying a biblical foundation for advocacy for the poor. Dr. Eric Costanzo, who, as you know, is moderating today's discussion as he brings his perspective as an advocate and a pastor. Also from John, I can't find my screen here. So anyways, here we go. Sorry about that. From John Lapine, who's the principal of Crossover Preparatory Academy in North Tulsa, and then Denny Fuller, who's the founder and executive director of Isaiah 58, which ministers to disadvantaged folks in North Tulsa, and she's a licensed crisis social worker with the Indian Health Care Resource Center. So this Oklahoma-focused NA webinar will help you understand really what is on the table with some of these issues and how you can be part of lifting millions out of poverty. And you'll find a link to register for that webinar in your chat today. Thanks so much.
All right. Hi, my name is Melissa Shepard, and I'm with We Welcome Refugees. And we started a new program this week, and I'm the community liaison along with another counterpart, Raquel Kyle. She was unable to be here today, but we are starting this grassroots Oklahoma collaborative where we can connect and advocate for our immigrant and refugee neighbors, just as we've been talking about here. So there's my email, melissa@wewelcomerefugees.com. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook at WWR_OK. We'd love to see you and connect.
Thank you so much, everyone. Well, those of you who are still with us, or maybe some new folks who have joined, we're really glad that you're with us today on our convening on immigration and faith. And we've already really heard a lot of great content and the heart of a lot of people who are involved as leaders and ministers and volunteers and servants in the immigrant and refugee communities around them and around the world. And we are moving now into our student leadership panel, and really excited to hear from our panelists here. The first panelist is Songmin Moon, an international student at Oklahoma Baptist University, my alma mater, and one of our sponsors for this event today. She is from South Korea. She's currently a junior studying international business, also involved in the Student Government Association and Omega Chi Delta. And mostly she says, I'm a follower of Jesus. And so we're really glad that she is here with us today. Also, we have Reverend Andrea Castaneda Lauver, who is a friend and been a real inspiration in my life and somebody that I'm honored to know. She's an alumnus of SNU. She serves as student and associate pastor at Houston's First Church, and also serves as the South District president of the organization Nazarene Youth International. She immigrated from El Salvador at the age of 5 and saw firsthand how the church thrives when it welcomes the stranger. Through the church, Andrea's whole family came to know and walk with Jesus. And in 2018, her eyes were open to the plight of many vulnerable immigrants living in the United States when the immigration provision that Andrea's family had been living on was canceled. Through that circumstance, God burdened Andrea's heart to use her platform and story to advocate for those in similar situations like her family. Andrea lives in Houston with her husband and co-pastor Kenneth and their 4-year-old beagle Phoebe. Great biblical name for a pup. And then we also have Angelica Villalobos, who is a DACA recipient. She is a DOJ accredited representative at the Immigration Center at Western. At the age of 27, Angelica became a DACA recipient, and she understands the transformative power that DACA has. Not knowing she was even undocumented until she was the age of 18, Angelica lived with a sense of shame and hid in the shadows. But in 2010, she stood up and started to advocate to be counted and has remained standing ever since. In addition to helping immigrants through DAOK, Angelica has received the Department of Justice full accreditation through the Immigration Center at Western Oaks Church of Nazarene, and where she advises clients on available immigration benefits and helps them prepare applicants. And within the immigration agencies, the Executive Office of Immigration Review and the Immigration Court, she does a lot of representation. She's a mother of 5. She and her husband contribute greatly to many in their community. And then we also have Andres Perea, who is also a DACA recipient. I had the joy of meeting Andres a couple of years ago at an immigration convening. He is a brilliant entrepreneur and the CEO of Perea Productions. He's, along with being a DACA recipient, he has lived in the US for 21 years, graduated from the University of Oklahoma with a bachelor's of science in mechanical engineering, and worked for an oil and gas company as a product design and project management engineer for 3 years. He recently resigned from that position to start his new journey of running his own digital media business. And so we're honored to have him here with us today. And so for those of you who are our panelists with us, again, thanks for being with us. We're blessed that you're here. And we want to ask, and if it's possible to start your video, that would be great. And if you're having any issues, just send a chat box note there to Hannah. But I see there's Andres. Good to see you, my brother. And Angelica, so glad you're here. And Songmin Moon, we're going to start with you. And what I'd like for each of you all, and Songmin, it's great to see you as an OBU alum and friend of Oklahoma Baptist University. Would you take 2 to 3 minutes? I know I introduced each of you in your bio. Would you take 2 to 3 minutes just to share your personal story with us? And Songmin, we'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Songmin Moon. I'm an international student from Oklahoma Baptist University. I came to the United States when I was 8th grade in high school in Shawnee, Kansas. And I graduated high school there because I fell in love with the American idea of like freedom and like all the different like involvement that I was able to do it, and I be able to come to OBU and be really engaged as an international student. Um, I was involved in SGA and Student Government Association. I was involved in the Greek Life, and I was a former president of that club. So yeah, I had a really good time so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Songmin. And Andrea, would you share your story with us?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Glad to be here. Like was in my bio, my family immigrated from the country of El Salvador when I was 5 years old. Since then, we got the designation of TPS, temporary protected status. Now, TPS, for those who are not familiar with it, it's really interesting because you have work permits, you have a social security, you have all of the different things that you need to live a normal life. And so I really wasn't even aware very much that we were on this status until I went to college and realized that even though my parents paid taxes and we paid into the system, I couldn't receive any federal aid or take out any student loans. And so that's when I really became aware of it. And shortly after that, temporary protected status was canceled in 2018, January 8th, 2018, for El Salvador. And it was also canceled for many other countries. And for me, that began kind of this awakening to the experiences that so many others in our nation have had, particularly those who are on DACA and those who are undocumented. And it was through that season of uncertainty and unknown where it seemed like, I recently, about 4 years ago, married my husband, Kenneth. And through that, I was able to adjust my status. But my parents are on TPS and can't adjust their status. And so just the fear of knowing that I could possibly lose my parents, that they would have to move back to a country that they haven't known for over 2 decades, that they would have to leave behind my sister, who's 15 years old, who is a US citizen, or take her back to a country that she's never known. Just the unknown and all of that gave me such a great empathy for the walks of life that so many walk. And as being the most important thing that I identify as is I'm a Christ follower. And one of my most important platforms is that I'm a pastor. God began to just work in my heart and stir up inside of me a desire to use my voice and my platform and anything that I have on behalf of others who find themselves in the same position as myself and my family.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And Angelica, would you share your story with us?
Hi, everyone. I'm a little nervous. I've done this a lot of times and I always get nervous anyway, but so my name is Angelica Villalobos. I came to the United States when I was 11. I actually it was kind of neat to hear some of the conversations in the previous panel talked about the DREAM Act and all of that. I remember following the DREAM Act since 2001 when I had just turned 16, and being part of following the whole immigration policies and everything along the way since 2001, but I didn't really became fully aware of the whole immigration realm until I was 18 years old and I wanted to get a driver license. And even then, when they told me I was undocumented, I didn't comprehend what the word undocumented means. And it wasn't really undocumented. It's a word that we always, as Hispanic people, we continue using, which is you're illegal. And then I'm like, well, I'm already working, I'm already driving. I really didn't know what that meant at that time. But then fast forward to 2006, my daughter, my oldest daughter, was diagnosed with ADHD and obviously was prescribed a controlled medication. And that's when I realized how hard it was to be an undocumented person in the US, because I didn't have a valid state ID to be able to get that medication. And I often had to relied on family members that had documentation to be able to go with me to the pharmacy and be able to get that prescription. And it was really hard to have to, follow, be after my family members and say, hey, can you do it today? There was a couple of times where she ran out of medication for several days before I could get someone. And it was very frustrating. And I think that's when I started kind of looking into, I dropped out of high school in the 9th grade when I got pregnant with my daughter, and then went back and got my GED. And I actually earned a full ride scholarship to the State University, OSU here in Oklahoma. And I did 3 years of college until 1804 happened, which was an anti-immigrant bill that unfortunately they didn't know how to deal with the new policy, that new law that was ineffective in 2008, that I didn't get to finish. And that's how I started getting more and learning about how I wanted to get into the whole immigration realm and say, I have to do something to be able to legalize my situation. Come to find out that for people from Mexico, in order for your family members to even sponsor you or petition for you, it's over 30 years. So definitely that was not a fast route, and started learning more. That's when the whole Dreamer movement came in 2009, and I was so eager to join them and be able to be part of that whole movement to see if we could get the DREAM Act to pass. Some of the people in our group from Oklahoma got actually arrested for civil disobedience when we were following President Obama at that time and interrupting him in several of his speeches. And fast forward to that, we all know what happened to the DREAM Act. It didn't pass. And then we pushed for DACA in 2012. And here I am. I am fully accredited, which is kind of like an irony, because I get to represent people in immigration law and help them with immigration benefits, but I cannot do it myself. And often people ask me, like, how is that? Like you get to help others, but you're not able to get yourself any documentation. And it's because immigration law, it's really hard. I think that I am very passionate about the work that I do, and often I agree to disagree with people when it comes to terms about the illegal immigration and about getting line and all of that, because if there was a line to get in, like, I want to know where, because I've been in the United States for more than half of my life. 25 years this year. And it's been very difficult to go through this whole process. So yeah, that's part of my story. I'm here to help, and I continue to be part of the fight.
Thank you, Angelica. And this is something we can definitely discuss. We'll give everybody an opportunity to have some question and answer with our panelists. And it's important to note here that we have folks sharing their personal story, and it takes courage to do that. And they're vulnerable in sharing their details and what they've been through. And it really is an honor to have all four of you here, just being willing to share your story. But one of the things Angelica said that strikes me is, you'll often hear people say, well, we just want people to come the right way. Well, just a little bit of education will teach folks that coming the right way is and Angelica described it as a line. If there's a line, there's different lines for different people in different places. And sometimes coming the right way is not altogether clear how to do that. It could last 10, 20, 30 years from some countries to be able to take those steps. And so there are a lot of complications there that aren't always as clear as simply just saying, well, come the right way. And so here we have some young folks with us to tell us about ways that they've been able to be here and work and contribute, but it hasn't always been easy, and there are challenges ahead. So thank you for sharing, Angelica. And then Andres, would you share with us just a little bit about your story, please?
Yes, sir. Hey, guys. Hope everybody's doing well. It's a pleasure to be here once again, surrounded by individuals who are, caring and concerned for this matter. Brenda, thank you so much for the invitation, reaching out. Eric, nice to see you and talk to you again. And Arlita, haven't talked to you in a while, but hope you're doing well. A little bit about me. I came to the U.S., came over here from Colombia. I was born in Bogota, Colombia in 1993. I came to the U.S. in 2000 with my mom, and just, going to jump 12 years here in 2012, like Angelica was talking about, DACA was passed. In 2012, I was a senior in high school, and just like her, I didn't realize that I didn't have any documents until you start seeing your friends drive, apply for the permit, take their driver's ed, and then, you're like, well, what do I have to do to take driver's ed? And then you have to basically apply, give them your social, and, you start realizing you don't have all these things. And that's when, it kind of starts to hit you a little bit. And then again, unfortunately, I wasn't, because of my ignorance in the immigrant topic and immigration, my whole life I've just been living in the US, and to me that was the normal thing. Like, I was good, there was no problems. So because of my ignorance, when in 2012, when you find out about DACA, that's about to come, well, it was the perfect timing, and it was a God thing, because I had just graduated from high school in May of 2012, and I was in this gap of, well, I can't apply for college, or, there's a difficult way of sense to apply for college because I'm not a citizen or a resident, I don't have a social. So you kind of start freaking out, but through prayer, through finding people that were very devoted to helping, I was able to get into a community college. And because DACA was right around the corner, I was able to continue my studies in 2012. So I basically graduated in May, start at OCCC, Oklahoma City Community College, in August of 2012. And in December of that year, I finally got my, DACA permit, basically your social and my work permit, to allow me to fully continue my studies without any issues, and obviously work and make ends meet for the time of that, which was from 2012 to 2017. So as Eric mentioned a little bit in my introduction, I went to OCCC. I went to school for engineering, specifically mechanical engineering. And so from 2012 to 2015, I did 3 years at OCCC. And then from 2015 to 2017, I finished at the University of Oklahoma. So I graduated with my bachelor's in mechanical engineer in 2017. Then I applied for an internship with Schlumberger, which is an oil and gas company in Little Rock. And I went there for about 2.5, 3 months. Came back, and for about 7 months was just kind of on a job search, and thankfully was able to land the job with a company from Switzerland, or they're called Weir Seaboard International. And long story short, I had the opportunity to work for them in the field of my study, and I was there for 3 years. And recently, about probably 3.5 weeks ago, resigned, and I started my own digital media company, which has been something that I've been growing, I would say, since I was a senior in high school. I've always had a passion for photography, videography, and just anything that you basically have, the ability to see on your phone. Where there's digital media content, commercials, all that good stuff. So wedding videography, portraits, quinceañeras, all of that. So like I said, I finally came to a point where it was hard to balance both things. both from, my work 9 to 5. And then after that, just growing my digital media business that I was, hoping to someday be able to do it full time. And surely enough, like I said, about 3.5 weeks ago, I took a step of faith to go full time into that. So that's a little bit about me. In a nutshell. Again, I appreciate you guys having me here, and I look forward to getting to know you more.
Thank you, Andres. We're so thankful for all of you so far. Want to ask you a hard question, and if some of this is emotional, it's okay. Take your time, but I think it's an important question for folks that are digging into this a little bit, just to get the fuller picture and understand. What kinds of sacrifices has your family made to provide you the future that you have today? Your grandparents, your parents, aunts and uncles, whoever it is, what kind of sacrifices has your family made that has put you in the position that you are? Songmin, can we start with you, please?
The sacrifice my parents made actually goes back to my grandparents. I'm in a little different situation. I am on F1 visa, which is a student visa that I'm here in the United States to study high school or middle school or secondary education, higher education and all that. So for me to get here, which is not a cheap way ticket, I have my grandparents, my grandfather who recently passed away was injured and he was labeled as handicapped, and government gave some of the money monthly, and he saved up that money and helped me to pay college tuition and the cost to come over here. So does my parents. Both mom and dad worked really hard to send me over here in the United States to study and to be educated. And I'm here by myself. All my family is back in Korea, and I'm here by myself in Kansas and Oklahoma. And yeah, so they worked really hard. And for my sacrifice, I have to be away from my family over 8 years for the better future and to fulfill the American dream. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you. How about you, Andrea?
Yeah, I helped write that question. I didn't think that it would make me as emotional as it has, but I think one of the biggest things that my parents have given up is their sense of belonging, to help me belong here, because when we came to the US, I was 5. So I learned English in, I think, 3 months. I don't even remember learning English. And my parents were already in their 30s. And so we know that younger children absorb languages at a much faster rate than their parents. And so my dad had actually studied here for his time in college. And so he had a much easier time fitting in. But my mom has a very thick accent. She understands a lot more English than she speaks. It's just, it takes a moment from the words to get from your brain to your mouth. And so I am constantly aware of all of the ways that my mom does not belong. And even at times, I think feels uncomfortable in situations, even at church and places that she loves being. I recognize that there's an uncomfortableness for her because it's not her native language. I heard someone say recently, like, I wish, she was talking about how her and her husband, she's Hispanic and her husband is Anglo, and she said, I wish that I could tell you jokes in my native tongue, because there's something that we miss when it's someone's native language, that they can't fully communicate, that, and also their relationships with their parents. My greatest distress right now is the unknown that I could have to raise children here in the US without my mom and without my dad, because my parents had to raise kids here without their mom and their dad. And so I just think they've given up so many tangible things, but it's also the intangible things that are most costly that have cost them.
You're right. You did help write the question there, but it's important, and I really appreciate you sharing. And Angelica, if you're still able to share with us, can you tell us a little bit about what kind of sacrifices has your family made to provide you the future you have today? Maybe we'll come back to Angelica in a minute. I don't see her video on. Andres, would you mind sharing with us?
Yes, sir. I'm just going to kind of piggyback there on Andrea. One of the most difficult things to constantly live with and deal with, basically as a DACA recipient or the other situations that ourselves, the ones that are benefiting from those sacrifices is basically seeing our parents not have their family here. From our perspective, I think we're kind of a little bit at peace because we have our parents. We've got our sisters that were born and raised here. We've made friends that obviously, we've grown up with them since elementary school or high school or college. So our lives have been built up here, but for them, you get to compare yourself with, hey, I've got this, and here's what they let go in order to provide us with the life we have now. So I think, that's probably one of the biggest sacrifices that they face is just, my mom hasn't seen her mom in 21 years now. My grandma's about 80, a little bit over 80. And, it's just a life, we all have an ending point, and obviously the older you get, that ending point gets closer and closer. So, that's kind of that's a sacrifice in itself, I think, and just something that our parents have to deal with on a daily basis.
And I think that's just so important to remember, that the decisions made by so many of our immigrants and refugees, but especially younger immigrants and refugees and their parents, they're not made easily or lightly. They come with a cost. They come with a lot of hard work and sacrifice, and for various reasons. Just as I, as a parent, would do anything to help my children succeed and to save their lives, for them to be healthy, so did your parents. So do the parents of so many, and the sacrifices that they have made have provided for us to have you even here with us today as leaders now contributing. Angelica, you're back with us. Can you tell us what kinds of sacrifices your family has made to provide you the future that you have today?
I actually got emotional. That's why I went off camera, but I think I would echo what Andres and Andrea were talking about, the sacrifices that our parents have made to have to migrate from their home country to be able to give us a better future. My mom's parents passed away last year, and she had not seen them in 25 years. So it's really hard. It's really hard because I love my parents, and I was 11 when I was brought here, and I do remember that relationship that I had with my grandparents. And as we were coming to the United States, which I didn't know I was coming to the United States, I thought we were just moving to like another place in town. I remember being upset at my mom because it was like sudden, and on my trip on the bus, I kept telling myself, when I get older, I'm coming back to see my grandparents. When I get older, I'm coming back. And they're all gone. Did I get to come back and see them? No. And I think that Hispanic, and I would say this from my own experiences, our family is very close. And family is really important to us. And over the years, keeping that relationship with our grandparents and talk to them and sending them pictures so that they can meet their great grandkids and all of that. I think it's one of the biggest sacrifices that I think that my family has made for us, having to grow up away from their own family because of their children. And it was really hard to have my grandparents being gone and not being able to have my children meet their great grandparents. So it's really hard. I think also one of the biggest sacrifice is the relationship that as a family hold. I remember getting together for holidays and visit my mom's parents and my dad's over the holiday season and stuff, and grow up with all of those neat traditions that we have in Mexico. And because of that, like within when my dad's mom passed away about 14 years ago, which she was the first one that we lost, I started teaching my kids a lot more about my culture. So even though I see that it's a lot of the sacrifice, it also taught me that it cannot be wasted. It cannot be wasted. It's because it reminded me of how much I had to teach my kids of my own culture as well.
I really appreciate you sharing that too, Angelica. It's just so important for us to have an understanding of that reality. And in our first half of our convening today, we talked some about biblical teaching. And we've had on here today, we've had pastors and advocates and ministry leaders. And there are many occasions in the Bible, our Lita Harris mentioned several earlier, where a parent has to make a hard decision. Think about Moses's parents. What leads a parent to send a child unaccompanied to the southern border of the United States? Well, the same kind of thing that led Moses's parents to put him in a basket and trust him into the Lord's hands. The same kinds of things that led Jesus and Jesus' parents to, at the direction of God, to go to Egypt and stay for a while. And there are many different things that relate to parents doing what's best for their children. And each one of our panelists here have parents and grandparents who have made sacrifices, who there has been a cost, and there's been a cost to each of our panelists. And as Angelica mentioned, some of those are cultural and familial, and it's just important to remember. And when we engage with immigrants and refugees in our community, through our churches, our schools, wherever it might be, they're in similar circumstances, and the empathy that hopefully rises up in us just as humans, but for those of us who are followers of Christ, that Christ-like compassion that says, what if that was my family? What if that was my story? How would I want to be treated? What if it's my child? How would I want somebody to welcome, receive, and give my child tools to succeed? And a lot of folks have come alongside you all and helped you in that process. So I wonder if each of you would just tell us of someone here in the United States who has been a welcomer to you, someone who has come alongside you and helped you, encouraged you, been a blessing in your life here in the United States. Songmin, we'll start with you again.
So interestingly enough, I didn't know anyone in the United States. When I first came to the United States in 8th grade, I was like, okay, God, I'm going there. Please provide, because in the Bible you said you'll provide. And our family just prayed over it, because I'm gonna be by United States by myself. And God had such a unique way to show me how to be a good Christian by putting some people that I never would have guessed into my lives. My last host family back in Kansas, when I was in the high school, that I still have contact with, she came out of nowhere and she really invested in my life. showing like reading Bible every day or going to church or be involved in the school and all that kind of activity. Like she also helped a lot of different international students in the high school area, and she's been the host. She's been like helping host parents understand the customs and all that. So there's she was that her name is Patty. And some other people from the church, they invested in me. They picked me up from school to bring me to study Bible and teach me the Christian values and American values. They embedded how the America is built upon. And even in OBU, we have such great faculty members. When I go talk to them, where they come to me and then ask me how studies are going, or if I have any issues, they told me like they can come personally and get help. And we have awesome person in her name is Joy. She helps out all the international students to get all documented or finding OPT visa and all that kind of stuff. So I was provided with unique relationship with a lot of different people, and I give all thanks to the Lord because He is the one who provided. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Andrea. How about you?
Yeah, so I have two, and the first one for me is my husband, who I met when I was 20, 21, 19, I can't even remember now, 19, in college. And the reason why the first person that I can think of as far as welcome starts so late in my life is honestly because for a long time, I think immigrating at 5 and processing through all of the last things that I just shared about just, you know, the loss and the not fitting in, my parents with thick accents, you know, now I recognize how grateful I am for all of the things that make me who I am. But as a young kid who just wanted to fit in, I was not grateful for those things. And so, if I could be real honest, I suppressed a lot of who I was for a very long time. And when I met my husband, you know, inevitably, as we started dating, he had to meet my parents and he had to come and visit my home and all of those things and meet my amazing and loud family. But through those things, his constant, oh, that's so cool. And, you know, when my mom would feed him food, he loved it, you know, and just his acceptance and his curiosity about who I was allowed me to begin to be proud of who I was for the first time. And so that was such a welcome to me. And then the second one, I think for me, has been Brenda Kirk, who is on our call. When TPS was canceled, I was kind of at a loss. I didn't really know who to turn to. And God put the evangelical immigration table in my life. And through that, I was able to find purpose in the broken situation. And I was able to find purpose, I think, for my own voice and my own story. And that being welcomed into this, being consistently welcomed by her in how she has opened doors for me to speak and to share my story, has, I think, been one of the most ultimate forms of welcome that I've ever received. So those two for me.
Thank you, Andre. And I'll mention as we go next to Angelica that we will have a question and answer time here in just a few minutes with these panelists. And at the bottom of your screen, there is a question and answer Q&A feature where you can submit your questions. And we have the ability to answer those questions personally, as well as perhaps address them with our panelists. So Angelica, would you share with us somebody from the United States, American born, who has been an encouragement or a blessing in your life?
I mean, I have a teacher that I haven't seen in a while, but she was one of the main reasons why I went back to school and I got my GED, and she's the one that put me in contact with the person and how I won that scholarship, because I actually going to college was not in my plans, and mostly was because I mean, I really didn't like school. The whole, way of like being a student, and teachers sometimes not being nice enough to where like, they didn't treat you right. And especially coming from a background where I had to learn English really quickly to help the family. But, she's the one that kept telling me, you have to go to college and you want to have a better life for your kids. Because I had a daughter at that time, and she really started showing me this different aspect of how successful you can be while continuing helping your community. And it was actually through a program at the church. So when I was raised in the Catholic Church, and when we migrated to the US, we started going to a Pentecostal church. And when I met her, I believe she was Baptist, and the program that I started going with was through the church. And I kept, focusing on, she kept telling me like, you just, all you have to do is have faith and pray, and everything will be provided. And you have to try hard to get the things. And I was in her class for GED, but she was actually teaching ESL, which it was funny because I was the only GED student that she had, while she was teaching a lot more immigrants second language. And often she would allow me to help her grade work and stuff like that. And she was really proud of me every time she see me coming into class. And and oftentimes I would want to give up and stuff. And the second person would be the attorney that actually got me started in immigration law. She was able to walk me through, and this was like back in 2008. And when I met her, it was through the WIS program, which was a tutoring program for elementary school kids that she was a tutor at, and the program was at our church. And we started talking. The conversation just started because I was looking for my nephew, and we started talking, and she invited me to come and visit her office. And then we got into the whole situation about my legal status, and then she started asking me or giving me more information. And if it wasn't really for her, I wouldn't be doing the work that I do today. I think that she brought a lot of value of the work that she did as an immigration attorney. And I really admired the patience she had to be able to explain things to clients. And a lot of the experience I have today and that I put to work on every day that I come into the immigration center is based off of what I learned from her.
That's fantastic. And the purpose of this question was that as we were talking about the importance of welcome and the sacrifices that families have made so that our panelists and others can have a future, and the importance of folks in the host country, which would be true for me if I went to El Salvador or Colombia. If I would need somebody to welcome me, connect me, help me. And so it's helpful to hear stories of folks who have done that for our panelists. Andres, is there anyone that comes to mind for you?
Eric, yeah. So again, I think we all have quite a bit of people throughout our journey that have been there for us. For me specifically, there's not like one individual that sticks out just because I feel like I've moved from place to place throughout the 21 years that I've been here. But definitely Arlita and Brenda are up there, because without them, especially Arlita, without her coming up to me at church one day and telling me, hey, I heard your DACA, and opening that door of conversation, I would not be here getting to know you guys, having these sort of conversations. I wouldn't have got to travel to Washington, D.C. with Brenda, and expose my story and just share with others and get to know about what's going on in our immigration system. And then, so those two amazing ladies are definitely some of the top two people that I'm grateful for and always will be. And in college, I would say there's a gentleman named Paul Burkhart. He was a big key, a big part of the puzzle to my ability to get into school while I was undocumented, waiting for DACA to be a thing. So, he was a tremendous help. And then before that, even the LCDA, the Latino Community Development Agency here in Oklahoma City, were the foundation for myself, and I would say more even for my parents, to be guided in the process of how the U.S. works, and really how, more importantly, how to parent. They took a lot of parenting courses with them early in the early 2000s, and they were such a big door. And later on in life, whenever I did need financial help, as we know, a lot, DACA individuals and a lot of us were not able to apply for government assistance. So we have to go to a different source, and LCDA was offering a $10,000 scholarship, which is the biggest scholarship that was ever offered in the program and has been to this day. And I applied for it, and as a God-given, I was able to win that scholarship. And with that, I basically, paid my 3 and even a little bit of OU tuition with that scholarship. So there's been a lot of hands and a lot of people that God had just placed throughout the journey. And I'm sure there's more to come, in the years of life that we are given here in this earth.
Well, and one of the reasons for asking that question is for those who are attending, when you can have the opportunity to be that person and to be on the list of someone who really does make an impact and does help make those connections and really change a life in the direction of a life. And in the case of our panelists, a family, so thank you all for sharing that. And it is always nice, I think, just to be thankful for someone and to say it out loud. As I've mentioned, we have the opportunity to ask questions and answers. I have another couple of questions I can ask our panelists, but I'd love to see if anyone who's attending has any questions, or if any panelists have any questions for each other. I don't see anything coming up yet, but if you would like to submit it, again, there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen there on this Zoom call, and you can use that and submit any specific questions for any of our panelists, or for me, or for anybody. And we would love to be able to address those. As we wait for a question or two perhaps to come in, we heard this last night in the president's speech. He called for it's time for a comprehensive immigration reform. Well, we've heard this for a long time, and what that means is it could mean a lot of things. But one of the things that I've certainly learned in my advocacy as a pastor, I've always tried to be very careful wading into any waters that are political. I've never been partisan in the process, but I've always tried to, as much as possible, avoid politics that might be divisive in the church. But what you learn when you're advocating for immigrants, refugees, and immigration situations is that some things can only be addressed at the policy level. And the more you get informed about that, you realize that, yes, there are some things that are quote unquote political, but they are pro-life issues. They are human flourishing issues. And it's okay for us to call on our elected officials and others to do their job, and to not just talk about these things, but to address them, and to share the stories like our panelists and others, to share those stories and say, these are genuine people. We know they're our neighbors, they're our friends, and they cannot take one more step forward. They cannot become citizens and do that work, even though they've been here for 15, 20, 25 years, until something changes. And so I want to ask our panelists, if you can just answer briefly, what would immigration reform, if immigration reform, an overhaul could happen, what would that mean to you? let's start with Andrea this time.
Yeah, I want to answer that twofold, personally and then as a pastor. So for myself, for my own family, that would mean a big sigh of relief. I feel like I've lived tense now, and I truly empathize with my brothers and sisters on DACA and who are undocumented, because I know that this is a weight that they've carried for far longer than just I have since 2018. You know, I knew we were on TPS before that, but it wasn't a threat until 2018. And so for me, it would be peace. It would be an opportunity for going forward, my future. If I'm honest, my husband and I we own our home. We are stable, you know, but I don't want to have kids yet until I know that my family gets to stay here. Foster care is a huge passion of mine, and I haven't wanted to bring in kids who need a stable situation into a situation that could potentially become very unstable very quickly. And so I think it would just mean getting to continue with the dreams that we have. And then as a pastor, I have students, you know, now this would be really broad immigration reform, but I have students who are amazing kids who are undocumented. I have students who have parents who are amazing human beings contributing to our community and our church, and who are, I mean, investing in the lives of other people's kids in the apartment complexes or neighborhoods that they live in, who live in fear and who don't feel like they have a future that is without worry. And I think just when we talk about human flourishing, that's what broad immigration reform would mean for me and for my people. So yeah.
And I think it's a good reminder, and you'll see some resources referenced in your chat box, that if you want to dig in a little bit more and learn, you know, Andre even referenced some of this would take some very serious reform in specific areas, but there are resources provided by the Evangelical Immigration Table and also the Immigration Forum to talk about ideas for restitution-based options for folks who are undocumented, to give more information about DACA recipients and dreamers in the process that hopefully will finally come to fruition, since it has so much support to create a path for citizenship for so many of those young people who are our kids. They're American, growing up in America. They're our kids, just like my own and yours. It goes across into a lot of different categories, but it's desperately needed. And so those resources are there for you to begin learning, beefing up your knowledge. And then there are many on this call who are a reference, and I'm happy for any of you, as I mentioned, from Oklahoma, to be a resource or a reference for you anytime. Try to point you in some directions, help answer some questions. If I don't know the answers, I'm sure I know somebody who does. And so thank you very much for that. We're still open for questions and answers. If anybody has any questions they want to ask, and we can address to our panelists. I will let you know as we're headed towards just right before 5 o'clock is when our time is scheduled to end. We have a couple more videos we're going to share before we're done. And also at the end, I want to just give us a couple of action items. I'll preview them now. Well, I want to encourage each person who's attended today to think about one or two things that in the next week you want to do to take the next step. It may be using one of these links and learning something. It may be taking an action step to reach out and figure out where you can connect to some immigrants and refugees in your community, or through your church, through a local school, through your local resettlement agency. Again, there are many of us on this call that can help you with that. But I want you to be thinking about some action items so that today hasn't just been about gaining information and inspiration and hearing stories. That's wonderful. But you know, we want to continue to take good steps forward and put our knowledge into action. So we'll be talking about that in just a minute, one more time at the end. Angelica, can we go to you? What would immigration reform mean to you and your family?
To us, I would say personally, it would be a sense of belonging. My dad has been in the US since the 80s and hasn't been able to get his documentation and status. And for my mom, I mean, same thing. I mean, it's just been so hard to even think that at any given time, just driving without a driver license, that they can face deportation. As simple as a speeding ticket can risk their lives. So for me, it's more of safety and sense of, I mean, they, in reality, I mean, they've been here for, more, I would say even half of their life as well. And as far as for the community, I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about and rhetoric that politicians use as immigrants, leeching off the public service and all of that, which is actually not true. Immigrants themselves without any documentation are not eligible for any type of social services. But then we do pay for those services. I mean, when we work, I mean, a lot of people probably are not familiar with, but the IRS has an ITIN number, which is an individual taxpayer's identification number that works to be able to file your taxes every year. So people who are here undocumented and don't have a valid social security number does file taxes every year. I wouldn't say everyone does, but most of them do. There's it's a little bit of $4 billion, I think, a year of revenue that undocumented folks contribute to the economy in the US. So the fact that if we get an immigration reform, it would be it would be good for the economy. A lot of us are already homeowners. There's, we already pay property taxes, and those taxes contribute to public, our schools, our neighborhoods, our streets, all of that. So, I mean, it's just a sense of like, I've already been contributing all of these years. I want to have a sense of acceptance in the US. I think that for me, when Trump took DACA away in 2017, it was really hard because being part of the movement and having to travel to DC often to be part of rallies and be part of conversations with Congress people and all of this, it was really hard for me because it's like I am a human being just like everyone else. And it seems like I have to continue fighting just for my existence and my belonging in this country. So immigration reform would be something that would bring a lot of relief to a lot of us. And it would just, like for me, just give me a lot more power to continue to contribute to this community that I am part of, that is not just undocumented, but it is also US born community that I have contacts with. So.
Thank you so much, Angelica. And, you bring up a really good point. And again, many of the resources we've connected you to in the chat box can give you some direction on this, but there's a lot of great information provided by the forum and the Evangelical Immigration Table about the contributions that immigrants make to our communities and to our country, to our economy. And as a follower of Christ, that's never my main motivation for engaging in serving and opening relationships and welcoming. But it's also something that I think is important to point out because of the benefit and the idea of community and what that means, and to not shortchange our immigrant and refugee neighbors and the contributions that they make. And many of you probably who are attending know that because you have some personal experience with people you've worked with or that you've hired or that you've gone to school with. But thank you for pointing that out. And again, there are many different resources that can help point us in those directions. I see in the some of you have just, instead of submitting a question, you've just sent some encouraging words to our panelists. So I hope that you all see that, and that you feel appreciated, and just know how thankful we are for each of you and the contributions that you have made to this panel today, but much larger than that. Just the blessing that you are to our country, to your community, to our churches, and to us. And I hope that you found today some new friends, and know that there are a lot of friendly faces here. Angelica, you said you were nervous. I hope you're not nervous now, because this is a safe place, and people like you are a blessing to the work that we're doing. And we just thank you so much. And I want to just, before we move on to a video, ask Andres, do you have any last word that you'd like to share today?
Eric, man, I think, Andrea and Angelica have hit it on the money. I think immigration reform, what that looks like is like they said, it's just, to me, what comes to mind is two words, and that's unity and identity. To know that what we're doing here is concrete, that it's going to mean something, not just for ourselves, but for the families that we decide to raise someday here, and unity in the sense of, I think, from an outer perspective of not just the people that are being affected from it, but American citizens themselves can begin to see the positive effect of what giving us residency and citizenship is going to look like to this country. I think a lot of not knowing always brings fear to people, and not having the immigration reform to the sense that it could be and it should be, is keeping a lot of people in fear. So to me, I think it would not completely delete it, but it would definitely cause a big relief to a lot of citizens when that happens. And like I said, I think it'll just unite us even closer, with the relationships that we've been able to build for the past 20-25 years that we've been here in this country.
Thank you so much, Andres. And Sungmin, do you have any final word that you'd like to share?
I totally agree, Andreas. Andrea and Angelica did an amazing job introducing about situations. As Andres presented, I'm planning to get a job in America and continue my immigration status, like improving it. And it's really important that sense of security and a lot of help from local people that support us who want to become like a citizen or even the green card situation. And it's really grateful that we know someone that are able to help us and able to provide the ways and resources that we needed. So we really thank you guys for joining and watching this seminar, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Songmin. Thank you, all of our panelists, and thank you so much for those of you who have attended. I've seen some names who have been with us for all 3 hours, and we really appreciate that. We do have about 5 minutes worth of videos right here. They're being really helpful. And then I will come back and just give us a closing remark. We'll be done before 5 o'clock. Thanks again to our panelists. I appreciate you all so much. Hope to see you in person as the world continues to open back up. See you in person again, but thank you again, each of you. And next up, we have our Immigrant Connection video.
Greetings. I'm so glad you decided to take part in Oklahoma's convening on immigration and faith. My name is Zach Samara. I serve as the National Director of Immigrant Connection. Immigrant Connection exists to provide church-based, low-cost immigration legal services in under-resourced communities around our nation. With 45 million immigrants, that's almost 14% of the population. The last time we've seen that type of demographic context was all the way back in 1910. My guess is no matter where you're located, wherever your hometown is, whether it's urban or rural, whether it's a farming community or suburban community, the reality is that you have immigrants that are your neighbors. The largest felt need of immigrants is access to immigration legal services. And what Immigrant Connection does is we help the local church, through a program that the federal government offers, receive the training and the experience they need to be recognized and accredited to provide low-cost immigration legal services to your immigrant neighbors. We've helped 22 churches around the nation launch Immigrant Connection offices. Together, we've served over 10,000 immigrant families, helped over 1,000 immigrants cross the finish line to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. We've helped over 500 students receive DACA. Currently, there's 16 other local churches currently in our pipeline, so our network will almost double within the next year. I have a few unique opportunities that I want to share with you that are a part of this conference. The first is that if you want to just learn more about Immigrant Connection, we regularly do introduction webinars where you can ask questions, you can learn who we are, what we do, why we do it, how you can be involved in partnering with what we do. The next one's coming up May 11th at 12 p.m. Central Time. You can sign up by going to icwelcome.org/intro. We also offer online learning cohorts, and I like to offer those free to those that are a part of this conference. Those are 8-week online learning cohorts where you learn more about a biblical perspective on immigrants and where you learn some basic overview stuff about immigration. And so 8 weeks, you go through a course with an Immigrant Connection practitioner. You can answer your questions, and you can learn more about rooting your perspective based on what the Bible has to say about immigrants, but also understanding historic and present pathways of immigration in our country. If you go to icwelcome.org/cohort, you can sign up for those. And once again, they're free for those of you that are participating in this conference. And finally, I want to talk to the young people. We have a residency program because the reality is this movement needs to grow into all types of communities in all types of churches. And so we have a residency program for students to join. It's a paid residency, 2 to 3 years, where you learn about immigration legal services. You work at an existing office for a year so that we can accredit you not to stay on staff, but to release you to start a new office in either a church planning team or an established church somewhere else around the nation. So if you go to icwelcome.org, you can see what our residency program is about and even sign up if you're interested in it. Once again, thanks so much for taking part in this conference. And we're so grateful that you've decided to figure out ways that your faith can be lived out as you welcome immigrants in your communities.
For too long, immigration debates have presented a false choice: secure borders or welcome vulnerable neighbors. As Christians, we seek a biblical approach. We believe our concerns and our values shouldn't be opposing choices. We can create solutions that both honor the law and are compassionate, that keep families together and are fair to all Americans. The solution to a broken immigration system is neither amnesty nor mass deportation. Christians across the country are unifying around something different: a pathway for immigrants unlawfully here in the U.S. to make things right by paying a fine as restitution for having violated immigration laws, then earning the chance to become lawful permanent residents of the U.S., all while ensuring secure borders and a more functional legal immigration process to spur economic growth, reunify families, and offer protection to those fleeing persecution. Restitution-based immigration reform holds the tension of justice and compassion. This pathway would move our country forward, but it needs your support. So we ask you to join other evangelical Christians across the country in asking Congress to act.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Once again, in the chat box, lots of information that can give you more details about some of these terms and topics. And I want to just especially thank our hosts today from the Immigration Forum, from the Evangelical Immigration Table. Lots of folks have been working behind the scenes to make this happen. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of our sponsors and all the help that's been given. This has been recorded. And so if you'll watch your email, wherever you signed up and registered, you'll find not only a link to the recording where you can share this for others who weren't able to be here today. And we highly encourage you to do that because it's really been great content today and a lot of very personal things shared that that folks put their heart into. So share it. You'll also be receiving a post-event survey. And so it will really help the forum if you will fill that out. And you can also reach out to Brenda Kirk, who's on this call, and you would have received a registration email from her. She'd be happy to help you. But you see her information there on the screen, and folks who are supporting the forum in all these different places and states. And if you'll fill out that survey, again, that will be helpful. And hopefully today has been as much of a blessing for you as it has been for me. Again, if you'll share this with others or share what you've learned, that will be wonderful and very helpful. And as I mentioned a moment ago, our last call for you is, what are 2 action steps you could take this weekend going into next week to either learn something new, to reach out to somebody, and take the next step to look for a way to serve immigrants and refugees in your community or through your church? And if any one of us on this call, including myself, can help you in that process, we'll be happy to do it. It's been a great day. Thanks to all my friends who were a part of it. This is something near and dear to my heart. And so I've been honored to be a part, and I look forward to connecting with you all in the future. Thanks, and have a great day.